Hello everyone, welcome. It is now 2 o'clock, I think. Welcome to this extraordinary meeting of the GCP Joint Assembly and Board. So it's a joint assembly and board joint meeting. We are here, first of all, I will explain why we are here. Those of you who are here, I think, are all aware that the Joint Assembly met on the 8th of June, and at that meeting it was proposed, and we subsequently, the chair of the Assembly and me agreed, that since the Joint Assembly mostly dealt with the consultation feedback at their last meeting and they discussed it in some detail, this is an opportunity for them to feed into the emerging scenarios that are part of the papers that are going to the joint, to the executive board later this week. This provides an opportunity for them to scrutinize those, as they didn't do on the 8th. It should be pointed out that this meeting is not a decision-making meeting. We are not here to decide on any of those scenarios, and those scenarios are not presented here for decision. They are just indications at this point of how the consultation feedback that the Assembly discussed in some detail might be addressed, taking into account everything that we heard. The board at this meeting will be essentially listening. We want to listen to the views of the Assembly. We want to see what the Assembly think of the possible scenarios that are before us, and we want to take that into account for what we think will be a lengthy piece of work, very likely to stretch further than the 29th of June, in terms of how we could take the feedback we received during the consultation forward. Having said all this, Nick, do we have any apologies for today, or Vilma?
Thank you. Yeah, we have apologies from Heather Richards and from Mayor Dr. Nick Johnson.
Excellent, thank you. Are there any declaration of interest from anybody present? I see nothing. You can declare interests at any point, not just now, so anytime you think there might be one, please do speak up. I am going to now explain the way in which we will structure the debate that is coming up. We will hear feedback from Tim about how the Joint Assembly went on the 8th. We will listen to what the Assembly has to say, and we on the board will ask questions about those. We will receive a presentation from officers on where we are with developments, and the Joint Assembly will debate the presentation that we will receive, and we will, as the board, ask questions of them as they express their views. And we will have some rounding up and conclusions at the end. So from here on in, I would like to hand over to Councillor Bick, who is going to tell us how the 8th of June went. Yes, Heather.
So just want to clarify the process from what you've described is that the Assembly will have a discussion and the Assembly is a scrutiny body, but the board will be asking questions of us, not the other way around, which would be the normal scrutiny process.
Yes. So the meeting today is an opportunity for you to essentially further debate things that are in front of you before we meet on the 29th. We will ask you questions of clarification as to what you think, enabling us to better take on board what you think. It won't be asking you questions as to, we're not scrutinizing you, we're just trying to get as much out of you as we possibly can in order to inform our meeting on the 29th. I hope that that makes it sound acceptable. Is there any further questions?
I think it sounds a bit of an odd way round of doing things, but you've clarified that the board is not here to scrutinise the Assembly.
It most certainly is not. Tim.
Yes, co-chair. It's very unusual process. So welcome to everyone from me, and welcome to the new friends that we've got with us from the board. The first thing I wanted to do was to present the report from the last meeting of the Assembly. That's not presented for debate again, because it's presented as the baseline for moving off from to take this further forward. So you will find between pages 3 and 6 of the paperwork the written report from the Assembly, and we're today focusing only on section 4 of that, which is related to the making connections item on our agenda. So when we talked about it that couple of weeks ago, we did arrive at a consensus that there were no external factors over the past year that had invalidated the process which had taken us to the consultation last autumn. Almost all members were of the view that the integrity and the reach of the consultation had been fair and effective. And examining the output of that consultation, a majority of members were of the opinion that doing nothing wasn't an option, and that the partnership should work on the issues raised, particularly in relation to the STZ, by some of those who couldn't support it in the form proposed. We then considered the various moving parts of the sustainable travel zone, and without more information, we were of the opinion we couldn't reach then firm views on potential changes, particularly information in relation to the impact of changes on various other factors and the way that different changes might work together. But we did go on and talk about them nevertheless, and in relation to our primary objective of reducing traffic and congestion, there was, however, little or no support expressed for the following: general resident discounts and exemptions, discounts and exemptions for electric vehicles. There was scepticism about varying the hours of operation, reducing the charge rates, and changing the zone boundary. There was general agreement on the importance of the low-income discount and a request for that to be fleshed out. There was a difference of views about general exemptions for hospital, patient and visitor access at the biomedical campus. There was concern expressed about the impact on unpaid carers, charity volunteers, and out commuters near the boundary, and the challenges of trip chaining, but feeling that customised exemptions and discounts might be hard to design and operate. There was a lot of interest in general free days for account holders, and there was also concern about impact on businesses, both on the positive and the negative side, which we believe needed to be considered further in the absence of information that we had then. However, none of these views were all provisional, so no one's trying to lock anyone into a corner here. There was a request at that stage for, there was not a request, sorry, for any individual changes to be dropped or supported. So in the words that were used then, everything was to stay on the table. Members felt that the priorities for the way the income from a sustainable travel zone would be deployed in relation to sustainable transport and public transport couldn't be properly addressed at that stage without more information. But a strong view from all quarters was expressed that about the necessity of accompanying whatever we do with franchising of the bus service. And then we requested a series of possible options to change the sustainable travel zone and for those to be tested against our original policy objectives, against the qualities, and against the capacity to support the bus and sustainable travel benefits that have been offered. So, having gone through that, ideally, let's move on from where we got to there, because our request for more information has been answered, and we've provided with more in these papers, and I think that needs to be the basis for the discussion that we're going to have in a moment. So where do?
Thank you very much, Tim. I would probably, before I carry on, I will explain how the co-chairing of this is going to go. Tim is going to chair the meat, as I like to call it, of the discussion. Before I take us to the next step, where the Assembly will discuss the recommendations that have been put to the board for later this week, I am speaking now to my colleagues on the board rather than the Assembly. Are there any questions for Tim on what he just said? I see none. No, not you yet, Katie, sorry. So if there are no questions for Tim, then at this point I would like to thank him very, very much for the report. What's going to happen now is in a moment, I'm going to invite Lynn to present to all of us about the meat of the upcoming debate, after which I will hand over the chair to Tim for an Assembly debate on what we're about to hear. So this is what is going to happen. Katie, are you okay to hold up until after Lynn has spoken? What would you like to say now?
Can I just thank you, both chairs, and thank you, Tim, for that review. I think it's one of the things that's really important is the gunning principles, and the last gunning principle is about conscientious consideration, which means we need to consider all of the feedback that comes from the consultation. So sometimes there may have been a lot of discussions about a lot of things and a lot of explaining, but people have still come through and made comments. So I think it is appropriate, unfortunately, to go over some things because we're still getting questions asked about things that I know have been explained, but they need to be explained again as a direct result of the consultation results. For example, workplace levy. It keeps coming up, and I think it's important the public hear us asking and it being explained. And I also think the varying the number of days, why maybe the weekends should have been included and have 2 free days elsewhere. So these are questions which have been discussed before, but I think it's important that we have the opportunity to come back again because we are still getting questions about these things. Thanks.
Of course, dare I say it, that's what the next part of the debate is going to be about. So I do actually hope that everything will be brought up that still needs to be discussed. Lynn, are you happy to take us forward now?
Thank you, Co-Chair. Thank you. So I won't, when we met at the Joint Assembly on the 8th of June, I went through the consultation details and the background in some detail. I won't recap all of that because the focus today is on the additional material, but I will just give a very brief summary and reminder of where we are. I presented the consultation headlines, the sort of top lines from the survey of 24,000 people that we carried out, with 70% of those respondents were in support of the bus vision set out for making connections. Between 70 and 80% were in support of most of the elements of sustainable travel and public realm proposals that were set out, the exception being car clubs, which was a bit lower. And 34% of the public that responded to the survey were in support of the STZ, which is the means of delivering those first 2 elements. Next slide, please. It was more than the survey itself. We gathered a large range of feedback from various places, businesses, representative organisations, other polling, and a series of issues came up, both through the open responses to the survey and through those other means. And so I summarised them for you last time. I won't go through them in detail, but asking questions such as, are the charge rates too high? Should we mitigate the impact on small business? What about the impact on low incomes? And so the paper sets out a series of questions that come from across those sources to be considered by any potential next steps. Next slide, please. And I set out for the Joint Assembly last time that there are sort of two broad sets of options for responding to the feedback that we've heard. One is to alter the basic parameters of the sustainable travel zone in terms of its hours or boundary or opening year or so forth. And the other is to operate the set of rules which operate as to how, when and in what circumstances people pay the charge. And there are almost infinite combinations of changes you might make. Next slide, please. But the fundamental point was to address the concerns expressed about the zone through the consultation means balancing that consideration with the ability to deliver the benefits that people through the consultation said they wanted. And that was the end point really for the Joint Assembly paper. And the Joint Assembly then asked us to go and sort of give them something more tangible, give the board something more tangible to grab onto for that. Next slide, please. And so the new material added in for the board paper, which the Joint Assembly is invited to scrutinise today, is that we have set out some illustrative scenarios which start to put together elements of changes you might make that aim to respond to the consultation feedback in slightly different ways for testing. Now, these are illustrative scenarios. More work would need to be done on anything if we were going forward, but the purpose of the exercise really is to start to paint a picture of the types of changes you might be able to make and what the impacts of those changes would be. So all of the changes compared to the orange shape there, which is the consultation proposal itself, which was that the zone would involve all-day charging of vehicles from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m, £5 for cars, £10 for vans and LGVs, and £50 for HGVs and coaches, covering the whole city. We've set out then 3 different options for changing that zone and set that against the option to not continue with the prospect of a sustainable travel zone, which gives you a range of sort of 5 scenarios to consider in this paper. The first scenario in the grey box on the screen says, what if we make a couple of fundamental changes to the parameters of this scheme? If the scheme changed to be not all day, but peak hours only, that would give a big chunk in the middle of the day where people could move around freely. Those who are not commuting at peak time could move around during the day. Businesses could move goods and deliveries during the middle of the day as well as in the evening. There would be a lot more flexibility to move around without being charged. That's one change. The second change aimed to respond to the consultation concerns around small businesses, self-employed traders and so on, around the sort of van charge. And says, what if, for a regular-sized van, rather than charging that an additional £10, it came down to the car price of £5. So that's the second big change. And the third is to say, we heard a lot of concern during the consultation about the hospitals being in the zone. And so if we could develop an exemption that sort of virtually takes the hospitals out of the zone by saying if you're end point of the hospital, you don't get charged, that would be the third big change. So that's sort of trying to play around with the effective boundary and with the charge rate and with the hours in that package 1. It's just one illustration of what you might change. Scenario 2 aims to come at the same concerns, but in a slightly different way, saying rather than changing the core parameters, what if you sort of give additional exemptions or change that? And the one that we've tested here is essentially giving a large number of free days of driving to people that sign up for an account. There would be choices to make about specifically how that was designed. You might taper it over time, as we've done in this illustration, to say that you start with a large number, which is about equivalent to 3 days a week out of 5, that you can move around freely, and taper it over time. You could taper it down to to nothing over time, or you could taper it down and leave it at a base level of perhaps 50 a year. That confers a number of benefits. One is that it allows people to make choices about the sorts of trips that people told us during the consultation feel difficult not to do by car. So a weekly big shop or taking a pet to the vet or things like that, which just feel trickier than regular trips. It allows an element of trying to support the behavioural change that the scheme is designed to address, so starting to get people asking themselves, Do I need to make a car journey today? Could I save it? Could I do it by some other means that supports that? And you'd have some control over how quickly you decreased it over time. So that's the sort of second where we sort of vary the rules of the scheme. The third one is a little bit of a hybrid of the two, tries to do a mix just to give you a spread of illustrative scenarios. And so that takes some elements from the first scenario, moving to peak hour only charging, removing the hospital virtually from the boundary, adding some free days in account holder free days. It also drops the charge for cars to £3. So that's the scenario that goes furthest in terms of responding to consultation feedback about the concerns about the zone. You'll see as we go through, it's correspondingly the scenario that goes least far in terms of being able to deliver the things that people told us that they did want through the consultation. And all of those scenarios, as I said, are set against the option not to continue with the option of a sustainable travel zone. Slide, please. Changes that we've suggested and tested for these scenarios, but there are a number of other things that sort of could be considered in any scenario and probably need to be bottomed out in response to the consultation. So we've put a little bit of detail about the potential definition of a low-income discount, but there would be more work to be done to refine how that should look. There was feedback during the consultation that mopeds and motorbikes should either have a lower charge or should not be charged. We need to think a little bit about the treatment and charging of goods vehicles and whether there's a case to do anything there, particularly around particular sectors or by size of business. We've been asked to have a little think about whether there's more that can be done to support unpaid carers, charity volunteers or community groups, whether a 6 p.m. finish is more appropriate than 7 p.m. to allow more evening activities, sports and so on in the after-work period. And the definition of the free days scheme. It could be that the free day scheme applies to households at a certain address. It could be that it applies to cars, and there will be different implications for either. And to consider whether, if anything, should be done about those who live near the boundary of the zoning commute hours. So in any scenario, you would probably think through those issues in the next step. Next slide, please. We've done some high-level assessments of what those might cost. There would need to be more detailed work on the details of how those played out. But if the consultation proposal gave in the early years around 50 million a year to disperse, rising to about 70 million a year thereafter, all three of those scenarios set out deliver less funding than that. Scenario 2 is the one that comes back, depending on how quickly and how far you taper down the free days, it comes back closer to the consultation proposal of revenue. Scenario 3 gives less money than 1 and 2, and of course, the option to not take forward a zone, then there's no income from the STZ. And for the bus network to be delivered as set out, would need to look at other options for funding in that scenario. Next slide, please. Based on modelling that we already have to develop these scenarios, we can say with reasonable certainty that all scenarios should improve congestion, bus speeds and reliability. Because remember we discussed in the last meeting that putting money into bus services is important, particularly for those services that aren't commercially viable and serve social needs. But that money isn't the only thing that's needed to improve the bus network for people. At the moment, one of the big factors underpinning the unreliability of bus services is that they're stuck in congestion with other traffic. So bringing down the overall level of traffic is really key in improving those services. So all of those scenarios should improve that. The modelling suggests that in 2041, in a do-nothing scenario with no STZ, traffic speeds will be down at 9 to 11 kilometres an hour. They would be about 60 to 65% faster in the peak in scenarios 1 and 2, and scenario 3, an improvement but less so, 50% faster. Assembly also asked us to set out equalities issues. The equalities issues are always, there's no sort of paint-by-numbers answer to equalities. There are a range of factors to be considered for various different protected characteristic groups. So again, as with everything, more work would need to be done on this, but in general, investment in buses is a progressive measure. It has more positive benefits in general for protected characteristic groups and lower income citizens who are much more likely to be bus passengers and to be reliant on buses. In terms of the scenarios where you go to peak hour only charging, it's worth flagging that key workers and shift workers and those with fixed hours may be less likely to vary their working hours to avoid a charge than perhaps desk-based workers, which means that the relief that some people get from the move to a peak hour charging may not necessarily apply to all, whereas a scenario with 3 days can sort of be used equally by everyone depending on their own patterns. The scenarios with slower bus rollout is probably going to disproportionately impact rural residents who are lower income but don't qualify for an exemption, who may be more dependent on buses. Scenario 3 in particular, which is the scenario with the lowest revenue, is probably the one that's least likely to benefit those living further away from Cambridge in terms of the ability to deliver rural buses. And it's worth flagging finally that in the do-nothing scenario, at the moment we know that commercial bus networks are struggling, patronage hasn't returned post-COVID, rural routes are commercially difficult to deliver. That situation is likely to continue getting worse unless some way is found to continue funding them. And so in the do-nothing scenario, the fact that buses are likely to, more services are likely to be withdrawn, will disproportionately impact the poorest and those with protected characteristics. Please. Just in terms of business issues, we've started to look at this, gathering information from the consultation. We understand that the STZ will have different impacts on different sectors and different sizes of businesses. Most businesses will incur costs to varying extents, and so this isn't a proposition where the cost of this falls only on residents driving around, it also falls on businesses. So most businesses will incur some costs to varying extent. They will be offset to varying extents depending on the sector by time savings and transport cost savings, and to the extent to which they're able to pass those costs on to customers. We expect that for most businesses, their costs will be felt most strongly earliest and then will abate over time as transport costs go down. It's worth flagging that services and hospitality, particularly in the city centre, are expected to benefit from better accessibility, particularly night buses, the ability to recruit in low-paid and hospitality roles. And those scenarios that go to peak hour only and allow movements in the middle of the day should offer greater flexibility and lower impacts for businesses who would be able to do free movements in the middle of the day, probably would sort of drive up congestion in the middle of the day relative to what it would otherwise have been. Scenario 2, with the 3 days, there's an element of free account benefit for businesses there too. And finally, in the do-nothing, it's worth flagging that this is an area with a really strong and growing economy where we know that it's go unfilled and businesses struggle to attract and recruit staff. And so in a scenario of doing nothing, that would continue to be a challenge and would like to get very much worse in terms of being able to retain those staff, particularly key workers and lower paid, who may not be able to afford to live close. In terms of the changes to the network that arrive, we haven't built these in explicitly to our 3 scenarios because in general those were the areas where there was least support, and therefore how you look at the bus network depends on sort of the outcome of what you do with the zone. In general, though, principles to consider from the consultation is a network less focused on the city centre, more multimodal use of the park and ride, so park and cycle, walk and bus, more focus on usability and safety of the network, and the observation that frequency and reliability matters to people as much as fares and new routes that, as I said, cannot be delivered by revenue alone. Next slide, please. We've just put a little bit in the paper as well about the potential to ramp up bus services. We spoke in the last meeting about the fact that the GCP board has set aside £50 million to start paying for the buses in advance of any charge coming in. We've put a little bit more detail about the sequencing and priority in which those might come, drawing in part on the consultation feedback, which is set out there, where fare subsidies might be able to come in from as soon as next year, depending on a decision, increasing up through out-of-hours park and ride services, new orbital routes, and then towards the back end of that ramp-up period, increasing route frequencies. Next slide, please. So the papers to the Executive Board on Thursday asked them to note the feedback from the consultation, as the Joint Assembly did, to note and comment on those illustrative scenarios that have now been added compared to the Joint Assembly paper, then to request officers to work with county to develop a preferred option based on the technical work and your steers for consideration in the autumn, to work with CPCA to impact what we found into their bus reform work and network review, and to start to flesh out the detail of what that ramp-up of bus improvements might look like for decision in December, depending on next steps. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Over to you anyway.
Okay, thank you. That's a long, short way of saying yes.
There you go.
So I've circulated to members how I propose to structure this, like I did in the previous meeting. I think we may be able to go through some parts of that quicker than others, clearly, especially supported by Lynn's presentation, which may answer some other points. So I'm going to move us on so that we don't lose momentum, because I know a number of people have to get away, as we should understand, by the end of the afternoon. The first part of what I wanted to look at, and all of this is in relation to the written reports that you've received, and it all relates to pages 35 to 50 in the report. That's the new material that we requested. So the first thing in relation to the actual illustrative scenarios that Lynn has shown on the screen and are described in words in the report, these are covered in sections 9.1 to 9.12. I think, without letting go and expressing all our views about them at the moment, because we're going to come to that, are there any questions about what those scenarios are and how they were arrived at? If there aren't, we can move right on, but I felt it was important not to skate over the possibility we needed to answer those kind of questions. So, Katie and then Heather.
Thank you so much. I must thank the officers for they're doing so much work to responding to all of our concerns. And I think you have, but the more we think about things, the more things come up. And it's, I think one thing about the scenarios is it mainly focuses on the vehicular movements and what happens there. But it doesn't, what we haven't got, I mean, I think you've explained earlier, is actually the 70% want sustainable transport and buses. But what we haven't considered is what are we willing to consider giving up? It's not, there's these scenarios and they're changing amounts, but we could turn it around and saying, okay, this 50 million will give us this amazing sustainable transport system. But then if we go to scenario 3 or something like that, we are going to have to cut back on X, Y, and Z. Are we prepared to do that? So we haven't thought about it that way, and I think it's for the young and the oldest and the low income families. It's actually saying, okay, what are we prepared to cut back on, as well as how we're going to adjust the parameters. And I don't think we've had much discussion on that side of it.
Thanks, Katie. We'll come back to that in a moment with Lynn. Heather?
Thank you, Chair. Or Co-Chair. I think I might just stick with Chair. That's what we're used to. You can decide between who's going to answer. So I've got a question on Part A and a Part B. Do you want me to give you both or take them one
Just
by
stick with A at the moment. Yeah.
Okay. So a lot of in the report is referred to people that don't drive because they're on low incomes. I was wondering what percentage of people in Cambridgeshire do not drive because of low income, as it does seem to be a crux for the argument for charging.
But does that relate to what the scenarios are?
Yes, in understanding the scenarios, because one of the factors in that is those people that don't have vehicles. I'm asking what percentage has been factored into that scenario.
Okay. Paul?
I have a question about the concept of 3 days, and just wondering if there are any examples anywhere or precedents of road charging schemes that have brought in 3 days, just to understand what are the risks and what are the likely administrative costs associated with 3 days.
Thanks, Paul. So I'll take those 3 first of all. otherwise we'll lose track. Lynn, would you like to respond to those three?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Councillor Thornborough, that's right. We haven't explicitly sort of done the reverse angle of that and asked, you know, what essentially what you should cut first. We do, though, have quite a lot of information from the consultation survey. We asked people in various ways about which elements of bus proposals and sustainable transport proposals they most valued, which they wanted to see first, whether they had any comments. And so we do have some information from that which would help shape a response to that. As with all issues, you are balancing sort of the number of people that say something versus the importance of connection, for example, for rural services. So we have some information that helps us make those choices. In terms of the percentage in Cambridgeshire that don't have cars, I don't have the exact number in my head. It is something in the order of 30-something% of households in the lowest income bracket that don't have cars. That percentage is lower in rural areas than in the city because people have less realistic option to not have a car. There's also a group of people typically on slightly above the lowest incomes who are in a state that we refer to as forced car ownership, where essentially they take on the cost of running a car or a second car that they can't well afford, that causes them financial stress because they feel they have no alternative. In some of the more rural wards in the city, the number is higher than 30%. It's, I think, up in the 40s or 50s. But I would need to get the exact number for you.
No, Lynn's speaking. She's continuing with the other answers first.
In terms of the free account days, I'm not aware of other precedents that do this scheme. There are schemes in various cities around the world that do things like allow cars with a number plate ending in an odd number to drive on one day and on the other, but that's more about a restriction of ability to drive rather than a monetary benefit. But there are various schemes that confer account holder discounts, which is what this effectively would be.
Thank you, Lynn. Heather, briefly, can you come back?
Sorry. Okay, right, we're back on red. Can I just clarify what was said? Whether that's 30% of the population or 30% of people in that income bracket? And if it's the income bracket, how much does that represent of the population of the whole, please?
I'd need to get the exact figures for you. I don't want to answer you wrongly, but it's of the lowest income bracket, around 30%. And then in the most deprived wards, that number is higher. And as I said, in rural areas, on average, that number is lower.
Thank you, Lynn. Christopher. Helen.
Thank you. It's really helpful to have the additional information this time. So, Lynn, thank you very much indeed for that. We focus a lot here, as we did in our discussions, on how can we address some of the concerns that people have. But unless I've missed it in here, one of the concerns we have when we make concessions of the nature we're looking at in these options is around the impact on the ability to deliver the public transport system that needs to justify it. And it seems to me the biggest threat to this is the credibility of the whole scheme is not having a public transport network that works from day one. And we could end up, I don't know the answer to this, but we could end up in the situation where we give the concessions to make it palatable and then end up with a public transport network that doesn't deliver anyone anywhere. And we end up with the worst of all worlds. And I just wonder whether any work has been done on the ability under each of these scenarios. You know, 3 days increases the number of people if they use them for the 3 days they go to the office, that we could end up with the same number of cars on the road as we've got today of people going to and from work. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. I mean, I think some of that is what we'll probably get onto in talking about the different impacts, but it's certainly valid at this stage. We've then got Helen and then Kristen Ann.
Firstly, in response to the question about other cities, I understood that Oxford either has or is going to have 3 days as part of their scheme, so I think that's worth us checking out. And the second is, in relation to the scenario that's got 3 days, how did we arrive at 180? Given that most people's working year is not 50 weeks, it's closer to 4 days, by my calculation, 4 days a week, and will mean lots and lots of people will not be paying it at all for the first couple of years. So I'm just interested in how we came up with that, what seems like a rather high number.
Thanks, Helen. And then Kristen Ann.
Two quick clarifications. One is just, do we know how much actually the scheme will cost to administer and run, regardless of how much revenue is raised through it? And the second is picking up on Councillor Thornborough's point earlier on in relation to free days. Is there anything that can be done there in free days over a 7-day period versus over a 5-day period? Or is that an option that's not available to us at this point?
Thanks very much. So those three questions, Lynn, could you help us with those?
Yes, of course. Mr. Walkinshaw, in terms of the risk of not delivering the buses, yes, that is, as I sort of pointed out, there is a sort of balance there. I think the purpose of the work so far was to try and identify some changes that could sort of have the maximum impact in terms of addressing concerns, whilst still retaining the maximum amount of benefits. And I think there would be more work to do to keep testing where you find the sort of right balance there, and that's ultimately a decision for political decision makers. Ms. Valentine, in terms of the 180 days, we were essentially sort of testing various numbers. The intention in the scenario, if we set it out, is that it would start at 180 days and taper relatively rapidly over a few years downwards. And the intention was to start with a level that felt not very much different than today, so that people could get used to the principle and the idea of there being a charge without being sort of forced to make changes very quickly and then over time change down. So acknowledging that for many people it won't feel very different in the beginning, if it's sort of 3 and a bit days a week. In terms of the cost of operating the scheme, there is some work set out in the strategic outline case which sort of sets out the high-level costs. We'd need to do more work. Some of the things we're talking about in terms of adding additional exemptions or varying things would change the assumptions around operating costs. So we would need to do more work to work that through. In the consultation proposal, there's quite a substantial net revenue. As some changes are made, that might start to sort of whittle that down. Did I cover everything there?
You include both of Kristen Ann's questions. Did that cover both your questions?
No, the second one was about the flexible days.
Yeah, I thought, yeah.
Sorry, I missed that one.
Do you want to say it again, Kristen?
Just wanted to understand, again, picking up on the point earlier about whether in flexible days that there was any scope to offer those over a 7-day period versus a 5-day period, or there was an opportunity to consider that combination, or that was not an option that was available to us at this point. So could you extend the scheme to 7 days and offer flexibles over 3 days?
So potentially there's, we can look at anything in terms of feasibility and deliverability and so on. It's something we could take away and have a look at.
I think as I heard it, what was presupposed by that question is that Saturday and Sunday were in principle no different from any other day, but they were subject to the application of 3 days. That, I think, was what you meant, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, so we would need to take legal advice on the exact way in which you'd find that. But in principle, there's no reason that you couldn't offer any day for free in an all-day scheme. We only consulted on the principle of charging 5 days a week. So it would be around whether the definition of charging there were different.
Okay, thank you. Katie?
So if a reduced scheme is agreed to go forward, will the initial investment that's been set aside be carried out as your diagram? And then will, depending on what the agreement is, would it then have to drop? Would we be putting something in based on the investment we've got, but then actually the reality is that we might have to cut back on X, Y, Z once we have to start charging? So actually saying we might be putting in a good thing, but then we might have to reduce it and then see how things go in the future.
Thank you. Annika?
Thank you. Mine was just a question for clarification.
I appreciate that the routes that come out of this eventually are not a decision for us to make, but when we are assessing the consultation feedback, will the Joint Assembly have any option to have a look at what kind of routes would be necessarily prioritised, or is it just an external decision from here?
You? Those two, and then I'm... Oh, Simon. Sorry, I didn't see you, Simon. Do you want to come in as the third in that series? And then I'm thinking of ruling a line under it after you.
Just reflecting on the discussion so far, I think that there are some important points that have been raised. I think the first one about car ownership isn't necessarily about car ownership per household. It's actually access to that car by other members of the household. So when a driver leaves the house with the car, there are people left behind who are now living in a carless household. And I think that's a really important point, because we can use that statistic of high levels of car ownership, but the really important point is about the numbers of people who need to travel or could travel if they have access to a better bus service that are actually isolated. And I think that's a really important point on the elements of this scheme, whereas what we're operating at the moment is actually quite regressive, and we have to recognise that. Car drivers have basically made buses unviable and driven them off the services off the road. So we need to recognise that point. I think the second point is just going back to Lynn's presentation, which was the seesaw. It's a really important slide, because what it shows is that if we make extensive concessions, we absolutely undermine the purpose of the scheme and the goals of the scheme, which is to reduce congestion, to create the space for the buses, and to subsidise those buses and have a new extensive network. So we could just make concessions right across the piece, and we'd end up with a scheme that really doesn't deliver our strategic objectives. I think it was the point that Christopher made. It has to work for it to have a credibility, and we can easily be drawn into making extensive concessions, for sake, which undermine its potential effectiveness.
Thank you. So I'm going to rule a line under the questions in this section, I think, with that. But Lynn, questions from Katie, Annika. I think Simon's more of an observation.
Councillor Thornborough, we'd need to plan the build-up of the bus expenditure from the GCP in light of where we expected the end state to be. Because as you say, it would make no sense to start running a series of services that then couldn't be continued. That wouldn't be in anyone's best interest, nor a very good use of public money, which is partly why it's so important to work out what will proceed here before starting to pay for the buses, so that you set in train things that then can be continued on by the STZ revenue, if that's what happens. Ms Osborne, in terms of the option to look at the routes, more work would need to be done to take us to outline business case stage, and the recommendation to the board is that if they wanted to proceed, we do that for autumn. And that will include more work on buses. Ultimately, though, CPCA is the Strategic Transport Authority for this region, and they will sort of take decisions on the operation of the buses that will naturally be sort of living thing over time, as you would expect all good bus networks should do. They will respond to changing conditions and things and make the appropriate changes at the appropriate time.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I'm going to go on to the next section, which is a bit of a change of gear, but it's the way the report is laid out, is my excuse for that. And that's the question of the low-income discount that we expressed quite strong views about last time. And in sections 9.13 to 9.17, there is a definition broadly of two different approaches to this, and I'm taking that as an opportunity for members of the Assembly to give a steer about those two different approaches and to give their views. And as we thought this was quite an important subject last time, that's why I singled this out for opportunity to comment now. So are there any points people want to make about what is essentially a raw income-based approach and an existing benefits-based approach? Heather, Katie, so far.
Thank you, Chair. So my question was around, it refers to potential means testing and how much that would cost to run, because means testing can be quite an expensive process to do, and often we find in councils that actually it's cheaper to just, you know, to give out a grant or something without going through the means testing process. And also, how often will the thresholds be reviewed? Just think in the current situation at the moment, you might want to review it, you might want to review it again, or is this one time only? Because there will be, you know, costs will go up, wages will go up. You're going to create a tipping point that people actually are then factoring that into whether they want to take increases because of how it's means tested, because you've got the stepping out. And what would you class as low income? I think you can't debate this without really knowing what thresholds you're referring to.
Thanks, Heather. Katie.
When we've been talking about low income and how changing again some of the vehicular parameters might be better than the other, but are there other ways of supporting the people on low income or key workers? So could we say, we have a definition of key workers, could those key workers have free bus passes to get to work? Could school children or subsidised bus passes if they're going to work? Can school children have free bus passes to get to school? Can the most elderly people who are the most supportive of the scheme, can we somehow support them, not to do with the vehicles, but supporting them to enable them to use the transformative bus system? So I just think the fairness issue needs to be not just focused on the financing, but the actual how we deliver it and how we can actually put things in place so that the people who need it most can get the most benefit out of it. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And that's an interesting question about whether it should be based on the cost side of the equation or the benefit side or both. Don't see any other hands. Would you like to respond to those? Neil, go ahead, Neil.
Thank you, Chair. It's about the benefit, and in a previous slide you could see the ramping up of services, and from the beginning we spoke about having the benefits in place before the charge. Do we have a clear definition of improved, just to concentrate on what the offer is? Because on the doorstep we get a lot of questions. What does it mean? And, you know, how improved is improved before we get hit by the charge?
Thank you. Lynn, would you like to take those three?
Yes, of course. Councillor Williams, you are right that means testing is very much the more expensive way of doing that. You have the potential to get to a more finely targeted discount, but at the cost of increasing the administrative cost of the scheme. And as we were discussing earlier, that's a little bit why we would need to update and review the expected costs of the scheme in light of how we decided to change it. Assigning the discount by eligibility for an existing benefit or something much reduces that cost, and you could implement a scheme where people just showed you their proof of eligibility for a benefit and updated it at whatever period you deemed appropriate, annually or otherwise. And that would be a much lower cost way of doing it. Councillor Thornborough, in terms of, again, flipping the way that you look at the support for low-income people, two things to say is, one is, of course, the possibility exists of looking at things like bus pass subsidies. The question really is sort of about the budget you have available to do that and how you prioritise it. In the consultation proposal, there was already the sort of proposal for a flat rate £1 bus fare within the city and a £2 bus fare to come from outside in. And the purpose of that in the original proposal was to support those most on lowest incomes. You'll probably be aware that the Department for Transport has had a scheme over this year looking at where fares have been capped at £2. The preliminary findings of that is that has been of greater benefit to people on lower incomes who are more likely to use the bus for in response to that. So there are various things you can do, but it will be a balance and decision in terms of how revenue is prioritised. And Councillor Shaler, in terms of ramping up the benefits before a change, that's really the final recommendation in this paper, is sort of to permit us to go away and do a little bit more work about the sequencing of how that would ramp up. The intention is to start with what can be done most quickly and is of most benefit to people, which is probably fare subsidy if that's part of the eventual package. And then to ramp up to the point where by the time the charge is introduced, you're broadly out the bus network you intend to carry on for the foreseeable future. But the sequencing will be a matter of sort of technical work to follow. In terms of the benefits being there in advance, though, it's worth saying the buses can be there. The fact that they will be sort of on time or not delayed or otherwise, that does require congestion to go down. And so those full benefits won't be felt until a charge comes in.
Thank you. Simon, then Heather.
I think central to the concern, if we look at table 9 on page 46, these are the scores against the multi-criteria analysis framework. And there's a column there which refers to quality of life and the 4 criteria around the quality of life, quality's impacts, social and distributional impacts, impact on road traffic provisions, and business impacts. And as you notice, that these are all quite low scoring. And I think whatever package we come up with, these need to be much higher scoring. And I just think that Councillor Thornber's comments were really valid, because the distributive effects of the new network, it's adopted, really need to take into account the places, the pattern of services. They'll be serving the most deprived areas or the most transport poor areas of the Greater Cambridge area. My view is that the people who are in receipt of a benefit that's been assessed by a third party is going to be the easiest method of administering the system. But we also need to recognise those people that might not entirely fit within that. So we've got the mobility impaired, those who've got no car, can't use a bus, that need access to healthcare, and maybe dial-a-ride is an alternative sort of source of provision for that part of the community. And we certainly need to be looking at carers who are in receipt or eligible for the carers allowance, and the use of, it's been suggested, free bus passes for specific groups, provides that flexibility within the system to make sure that poor people are not made worse off by this, but they're made better off it. And as a whole, as Lynn's just said, the whole strategic objective of the low-fare system is progressive in itself. So this is in my view, this is an area of we need to make a decision that's evidence-based. We need a lot more evidence to support this and look at all the possible dimensions that will help the poorest, most transport-deprived people in our community.
Thanks, Simon. Heather? And then Helen.
Thank you. Just one thing that I asked earlier, and then I have a different question, Chair, is about what is low income. I think the board need to say what they are classing as low income when they make a decision, and they'll need some information, because until that definition is in place, everything else is meaningless, because people may feel happy because they think those, but actually there is a subjective thing. Their view of low income is different to the person next to them, and so one person actually, when they find out the reality, would not be happy. So I don't feel we've ever been able to get an answer to that question. I do think the board need it. On page 39, 9.16, one thing that I would particularly ask the board to consider is if they go on household income, the repercussions that that can have. Now, independent taxation for women is more recent than you'd like to think. And one of the big issues that came out of it pre-independent taxation was it was very difficult for people in potentially unpleasant domestic situations, shall we say, to be able to build themselves a security net that their partner didn't perhaps know. Financial control of assets is a big way in which domestic violence can thrive. On that basis, anything that gets put forward, I would ask the board to really bear that in mind, because if you're doing a joint income for the household, that will mean the disclosure of everybody in that household sharing their financial information for the purposes of this. And I know many of our councils support things like the White Ribbon campaign, and I would argue that the household income, appreciate there are problems because you can have very different earnings between spouses or partners, but I do think it's an important one to make sure that nobody becomes vulnerable by having their finances exposed due to something like this.
Thanks, Heather. Helen.
I think it's highly unrealistic that we would come up with our own means testing scheme when there are obviously government kind of measures that around eligibility for benefits. So I see that as a much more realistic and cost-effective way forward. I think I'd be inclined to say let's be generous about that safety net and which benefits are included in there, whilst all the time bearing in mind the last thing we want is a perverse incentive for some people to buy a car thinking I'll now have a car to run on those lovely uncongested roads in Cambridge. So whatever scheme we do come up with, I think we've talked about this before, but the bus fares need to make sure that it's still preferable to travel by bus than by car.
Thanks, Helen. Those are 3 questions. Lynn, would you like to respond, please?
I think I'll just sort of note and accept Councillor Smith's comments about quality of life being an important criterion and needing to make sure that we design a scheme where that is front and centre. In terms of Councillor Williams' comments about low income, we've suggested there the Office for National Statistics definition, which is 60% of median income. I absolutely take your point on separation of finances, and that's one of the things that make this, make the means testing a much more complicated and tricky option. And in terms of Ms. Valentine, I just sort of note your points. Yes, means testing according to benefit receipt is a lot simpler and straightforward, and there is, of course, then the opportunity to take a generous view of which benefits you include.
Thank you. Katie?
Thank you for coming back from my other question, my previous question. Can I just follow on from that about putting this? You answered about the buses and the bus fare being £1 and £2, which I completely accept. But also, I spoke to somebody working in a sandwich shop. She wants to be able to invest in an electric bike so that she can use the new greenways to cycle in from Willingham. She has to drive in at the moment. But she's worried about how she's going to actually finance the electric bike, and also how can she be sure that it will be safe when she parks it in Cambridge. She says when she drives in the car, she knows the car's going to be there when she needs to go back. But she would like to put something like that in place before a car charge comes in. But also the older people who want to go on the buses, they tell me that the number of bus stops have been reduced, so they have further to go. So it's putting back in bus stops, making sure that they can sit and wait, and making sure but it's also about walking for enjoyment and for health. So it's also making sure we put those benches in along greenways as well and things like that. So it's that kind of support for those people. It's not just, it's the active travel support as well as the bus support. Thank you.
That's just a note, really, is it, Lynn? So I'm just going to try and summarise where I think we've got to with this, and please resist if you think I've got it wrong. But I think that in terms of the way the officers have written the report, it's about a low-income discount on the road charge in the STZ, and they've written it like that because they were asked to do that by the way that we had specified for the original proposal. But what I'm hearing, and what personally to me makes sense when I'm reading these sections, is of the choice of two approaches, the one that involves using existing benefit schemes seems to be the logical approach. I didn't hear anyone express a view on the other side, so unless someone shouts at me, I'm going to say that would be our view. Then I did hear that there is interest in developing ideas around a low-income approach in relation to benefits, which obviously we have no information of the impact of and what that could be. We had some ideas given, but I think that we would like to put that on the radar screen of issues to take further if they look good when they've been analysed. So with that, I'm going to go to the next section, which is the one immediately following in the written report, which is section 9.18. There are a list of things there which the officers are asking whether these, having been put on the radar screen, as they have been, whether we are content for those to be developed as part of the next stage, or, I mean, the alternative to that would be we wrestle about those now. And maybe, Lynn, you'd like to just say some more about the choice involved here, because I think those things, to greater or lesser extent, matter to us from our previous conversations. But the way the report is written, it seems like you would like us to be confident that they're on your list, but they would be better dealt with as part of a more focused analysis in relation to one or more scenario.
That's correct, Chair. So, as you would expect, there's a range of evidence from the consultation feedback and technical work to do. We're just flagging to you that those are issues that we would need to consider and bring back to you, sort of in any scenario. We've tried to give you illustrative scenarios which show you the big picture direction, but there'd be other things to nail about any scenario.
Are members content that we treat that list in that way and we move on to the next section?
A question about the definition of low income again. Just to come back to it, we have poverty as a protected characteristic, but I'm interested in the knock-on effects. So where we are improving transport from areas that are currently transport poor in the city and outside and in rural areas, that should allow people to remain there who currently are being forced out, or even allow people to move into those areas and reinvigorate some of those areas. Has this been modelled, the possible change? I mean, this goes along with our wanting to model growth, to plan growth, not as it's been previously, pretty much unplanned growth in the region.
I've got a lot to do with what's in the report, but let's see if Lynn has a comment on it.
Thanks. just to agree with you really that assessing the impacts in any sense of this is about assessing the impacts of the whole package, not just the zone itself. So the zone on one hand in terms of how that affects drivers and the bus and sustainable travel improvements as well. So it is about the package and there is an element of judgment in how you weigh them up.
I'd also probably just add, Chair, if I can, we obviously work very closely with the local planning authorities and in shaping, the local plan, then they take into account, transport demands, and we work really closely to ensure that there's a sort of joined up sense of how you best manage growth in the future.
I see some hands going. The longer you want to talk about this, if it's just to reinforce what is on the page, it's maybe not necessary because we have time and we haven't got to the meat of the matter yet. You need to speak now, Mike?
It's a very quick question, Tim. On the penultimate bullet point about free-day scheme, are you looking for the board to give a steer as to which they want? Or are you just saying explore all? It says whether any free-day scheme should apply per car, per household, or per address. Because I know this has come up in our group meetings. So are you asking for... Are you asking for a steer, I think is what I'm saying.
I wasn't asking for a steer, and officers, I think, would like to put something more on the table before they ask for a steer. That's what I'm whispering in my ear. Okay. So is there anything compelling in relation to these points, given that they are on the radar screen and officers are going to work on them next? Great, thank you. So I'm going to go then to the next section. So this really is the meat of the extra information, section 10, which is the impact of the illustrative scenarios that have been described, pages 40 to 49. Are there any factual questions of clarification on this? Katie?
Can I just be sure that I think that basically these are, am I right, that these are 3 scenarios that you've put down so to create a discussion and a debate, and there's any number of scenarios and there's mix and match? Yeah, just wanted to...
That's what officers said, yeah. Okay, so let's... Brian. It's not used to hands, the whole 360. Is
that working?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, just a quick question about income-based use of, for example, universal credit. Is it possible to save money by assessing anybody in receipt of universal credit would be allowed? And have we done any work on assessing what the cost of doing such a scheme would be?
I think I know what the answer to that is, but it's probably better if an officer gives it.
So in terms of which benefits would be eligible and whether all of universal credit or just those on some elements of universal credit, that's all work we could do and options. We've done some very high-level costings of that, but we'd need to do more work to give you a more definitive answer.
Thanks. So let us move on to the discussion, the comparative discussion, because I think there comes a point where you have to discuss things in relation to other things. We can't do this in sort of perfect silos, I think. I think what would be helpful to all concerned, officers and board, would be views members have on the relative strengths and weaknesses of these alternative scenarios. Are there any particular scenarios that would give you cause for concerns about pursuing them any further? And is there one or more scenario that you pick out specifically for further development? Are there views about blending between scenarios? So who would like to start us off on this? Claire.
Thank you. Scenarios provoke clarity by being specific about what to think about, so thank you for putting these scenarios forward. None of them are perfect in my view, but some of them are very imperfect, and therefore I would like to start by discounting one or two, and then we can get on to the discussion of mix and match on the others. So as we're talking through this, I understand much better the why we're doing this and fully endorse why. We're now in the details of how. And in particular, I think that doing nothing, which is still one of our options, is very punitive to anyone with less wealth, as measured by less access to private transport. So for me, do nothing comes off my list of options going forward. Furthermore, I think any scenario that doesn't cover fair improvements to public transport, sustainable transport, is neither bold nor progressive in what we're looking for. It won't give access to the jobs and education, which is what we're here for. We're here for access, not reducing things. We're here for more access to jobs and education. So there are many things that I like about each of the scenarios and dislike about each of the scenarios, but anything that arrives at an answer that is too small to be useful to us, I would have to discount. Having said that, I like charging more people less money, just because I think it is much more sustainable, easier, fewer edge cases, and all the other good things about measuring less and just delivering more. So the lower charge, which then we can inflate, so £3 now, inflated to 2029 levels, is more sustainable in my view than just saying £5, and then at which point do we say, actually, it's now £5.20. So those are my comments, and I will come on to discrepancies between scenario 1, 2, 3 later, but just those are my overview. Do nothing is not an option, and something that comes up with less than enough is not an option really either.
It's a good start. Thank you. Graham.
Thanks, Tim. We did have a bit of a debate last time about access and parking at the hospitals, and I just wonder if we've come to any conclusion about that, particularly when it's included in one scenario and then instead there's an alternative for 3 days in another. So it'd be helpful for me and maybe for others if we could try and get the differences in officers' view about the pros and cons of each. Thank you.
Helen.
Oh, sorry, I'll keep this.
Heather, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. So I'll start off. Personally, looking at the options, I think they all should be discussed and the merits pro and against be done. But the fact that the option for no charging is labelled do nothing, I think is really negative and defeatist way of looking at it. We can see from the results, some people are no to the STZ, but they're not opposed to change. And this idea that if we don't charge people, if we don't punish them with a charge, that we can't do anything, our hands are tied behind our back, is not reality. We can still do things. We just might need to be a bit more imaginative about it. And actually, by saying do nothing as an option rather than no STZ, it does show that we've been sort of one-track minded to do this and not really open to any alternatives, which I think would be wrong. There should be a proper no STZ option, which I don't feel there is at the moment. There's lots of things that could be achieved without charging and explored: lane expansions, reopening closed lanes and roads, longer park and ride hours. You want to help with climate issues, more charging point infrastructures to make that more appealing. We've discussed at length about buses being franchised, the use of technology to adapt timetabling to make buses more appealing, shuttle buses like the Addenbrooke's one, but other shuttle buses from Park and Rides that take people directly where they want to go. Installing hospitality units, so if you have to stay for an interchange at the Park and Ride, then perhaps it's more appealing and you wouldn't mind so much if you had somewhere warm and not stood outside in the cold for 45 minutes. Actually making the services that we have better. The Park and Rides in particular need a lot of improvement. We haven't fully, in my view, looked at the impact that the railway station at Addenbrooke's will have. We know that's coming along online soon. We can look at better ways to utilise Cambridge North and the relocated Waterbeach station. Even there are light rail solutions. There are lots of things out there. Work could still happen with businesses and the hospital for incentive schemes. up and down the country, councils are making changes without financially introducing an STZ zone. Whereas this is just, well, we do nothing if we don't introduce charging. I think we do have to talk about aspiration as well. If people are trying to do the right thing, lots of people are trying to do the right thing, move to hybrid or electric vehicles. And so I wouldn't be, I wouldn't be keen on exempting some and not others, but I don't think we should be charging them. And actually what you're doing is trapping people in those cars for longer, which seems really counterproductive if you, want to do this for the environment, as I know some people do. The costs of administrating each scheme must be included for the board when they're taking any decisions forward. Otherwise, we don't actually know how much profitability there is in these schemes and therefore how much could be given. People wanting to start up businesses would struggle. We've heard of other struggles as well, and the Cambridge Restaurant Group, I know, sent documents out to all of us. I thought they were, what really stood out for me was how far-reaching. We had NHS, we had university departments, we had John Lewis, lots of people, Age UK, showing concerns about it. We've had a big debate on low incomes. Actually, we know that it's a very small number of people that don't have cars. And those people, we know there's quite often areas of deprivation, so we could target more bus support there. There is a new tax that's already been put on people, so that money could be used for that. There's lots of things that could be done under the current funding and the sort of capital costs that the GCP could fund, which aren't being explored and not being put into this. It does say like other funding could be made available, but they label it do nothing. Cambridge is meant to be a place of innovation, and yet more buses is a very 20th century solution. I will get on a train for long journeys, sometimes even if it takes me longer on the train than in car, because I can work on the go on the train. I'm not losing those work hours. You don't have the same facilities and infrastructure on the buses. There isn't the plugs to plug in your laptop or Wi-Fi, etc. So looking to something, even having tables on the buses makes it difficult. Look at today, I've got a drawer turned upside down, but it's enough to work off. All these sorts of things that would actually reflect the way that we work in the 21st century. And I don't think buses, just more and more buses, will just end up with congestion of buses. I don't think there's anything wrong. I appreciate some people feel we've been down this road for so long that we just need to get it done. I understand their desire to achieve something. I have the same aspiration in resolving these issues that we face. But I do think that the STZ is a mistake. I think the fact that if you put this forward without giving the consultation results and we don't give it a proper alternative would be really damaging for all of our reputations, especially as it's already been vetoed that there wouldn't be a referendum on it. So we need a proper STZ, no STZ option on the table for the board to consider. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Heather. I'm not sure that's something really the officers are equipped to respond to, because it's quite a political statement, really. So I think we'll have to note it.
Chair, a lot of the statements in here have been political. I don't see why you're pulling mine out.
Well, the other thing I was going to say was that those were the sort of points we were capturing from you in our last meeting, which we did, and no one agreed with you. So I think the response I would give is that you mentioned some very good ideas, but they require a magic money tree. If that colleagues had charge of this, none of those things ever did happen. And secondly, the key facilitator for all of the changes we're talking about is the reduction of congestion. Unless we can achieve that, then we're not going to be able to make many of those other improvements. But thank you for your speech, and it is noted, everyone has heard it, but I don't think there's anything the officers can really respond to there. Yes, I'm wrong. Thank you. So let's...
Chair, so can I clarify that there's absolutely nothing that can be looked at in working up an alternative or even changing the name so it's something more positive and rather than don't do nothing?
I'll ask officers to comment on that point.
Sorry,
yeah.
we should we can perhaps more, we could perhaps refer to it as a no STZ scenario. It's not intended to do nothing ever in any scenario, but that was the sort of proposal that went out to consultation, to which, you know, we're considering the next step. So not doing this thing is perhaps a better description. No STZ.
Okay, thank you. So take one more, which was Helen. Yeah.
Hopefully quite succinct. I think we should rule out do nothing or no STZ. I completely agree that we perhaps should change the label. I think we should rule out carrying on regardless with no amendments to the scheme, because I don't think the feedback would support that. I would also rule out option 3 because I don't think it generates enough revenue. So I think we're in the kind of ballpark of options 1 or 2. Like Claire, I don't really like exact packages in either of them, but we know that they're for illustrative purposes only. So essentially, I support an option that does make some changes in response to feedback, but still generates enough revenue to do something very useful with the buses.
And I don't think there was anything for officers to come back to there, but that's an important contribution. So, other hands, I've got Graham.
Thank you, Tim. I just wanted to support Heather slightly in that I think it would be helpful when the officers present the options to the board that you definitely include the admin costs of running the different schemes so that we can see the net gains rather than the gross. And it may be that the net gains is what's in here. In table 5 on page 41, the option is described as no STZ. And I think that's how it should be helpfully described. If anything, it would be useful to add in some other option about minimum delivery of bus improvements or something. But if we were to do that, I would be interested in knowing exactly how that was going to be funded, because there is no indication within any of the papers that I've seen that there is any mechanism to fund that other than through the city deal and the money that the STZ is going to raise. Thank you.
Chair, I just wanted to, as an overriding thing, say that the Making Connections aim was to create conditions to provide more people with genuine alternatives to car travel, and I think that's an important thing that we have to have in our mind when we are considering these scenarios. And I, again, agree with Graham and Heather that it would be good to know the admin costs for each scenario modelling moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I know we're thinking about moving forward, but I think we should also remember that certain commitments have been made at the combined authority level, at local authority level, the county level, and I would like to know if the different scenarios are going to affect the commitments we've made to do with carbon reduction and traffic reduction, which is which the county have committed to and the combined authority have committed to. I also think we should be aware, or the board should be aware about that the government are thinking, the government are going to have to do something because fuel duty is going down very sharply, and the funding, that critical funding will be, they need to find it, replace it, and I think the future, what might happen is important. But again, the Citizens' Assembly recommendations were accepted by the board, and again, the different scenarios going forward, I'd like to know whether they actually meet the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly, or do they fall short, or would it mean that if we went with somewhere along scenario 3, would that mean we meet the recommendations but over 20 years rather than 5 years? Yeah, I think those are my main points. Thanks.
So that's a question in there, which I will come back to in a moment. But then we have Karen, and then Kristen Ann.
Claire's been very tentative. Claire was first.
They're saying Claire was first.
I want to make quite a general point. I think making connections is not just about bus travel or congestion charge or no congestion charge. It's also about walking and cycling. It's the whole package. And I think we really need to see that in the round. And when we're thinking about the different scenarios and we're thinking about the people who live and work in the city and people who live outside in the city and come to work in the city, I think we also need to think, we need to see things in the round and think about fairness there. On the table that Simon referred to earlier, I can't remember what page it's on, Simon, where quality of life was discussed or set out. Walking and cycling was also mentioned there. You can walk and cycle so much easier in the city than you can walk and cycle in parts of East Cambridgeshire or to the east of the city. And I think when we're thinking about equality, fairness, low incomes, car ownership, we've got to think about the whole picture and access, all means of access, walking, cycling, bus travel and car travel as well.
Does that lead you to a comparative view between the scenarios?
Between the scenarios, I'm looking at scenario 1 and 2 at the moment, and I'd like to have more discussions on scenario 1 and 2. But I've got lots of questions about them, and I really do want to think about the whole of Greater Cambridge and the wider picture, all methods of transport.
Thank you. Then Karen. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. I'm also supportive of us doing something, and I'm leaning towards options 1 or 2 or combinations of those. The thing I think I'd like to consider when we're considering those, and it's something that we've raised in the past and Christopher raised it earlier, is having an option that actually shows some early benefits, because we do need to change people's behaviour and we need to build confidence that this can be delivered and that buses and other sustainable travel routes are viable. So something that we can show some benefits early on to encourage that change in behaviours and those mode shifts as well. So really thinking about that as we look at the different options or combinations of those, please.
Thank you. And Kristen Ann, and then we'll come back to Lynn for the answer to that question.
And I'm not sure if there's a question here, but my views on the options. I also, over the course of this, have been convinced that we do need to have an independent revenue stream to support transport in there that is sufficient in size to do the improvements we want, and that through the history of different consultations, the form of sustainable travel zone is the way to raise that revenue. So don't feel that not having a sustainable travel zone payment scheme is an option we should be considering. In terms of comments on the options, I am interested actually in the comments and the evaluation that has been brought forward in order to enhance behavioural change that the flexible day scheme could offer. It wasn't something that I'd considered hugely before, but potentially as a way of encouraging that, bringing it in, allowing people to change their modes of transport over time, to experiment with different transports, I think has an interesting option. I do think it would need to be, though, potentially considered in light of also running the scheme over 7 days, because I think otherwise you get judgments of one day being more valuable than another for different communities and groups and people working irregular hours and things that would seem therefore unfair to. And then I've also been very struck by Table 9, which does look not just at the revenue-raising opportunities, but all the benefits of the original strategic objectives of the scheme, which I think is quite a holistic way of evaluating the scenarios. And in that one, very struck by the difference in scores and how actually, not necessarily exactly presented as it is, but scenario 2 scores very highly against those original criteria.
Thanks, Kristen Ann. I'm just going to ask Lynn, there was a question in there that needed an answer. Not from Kristen Ann, but from someone else, and I can't remember who it was. It was Katie. Go ahead.
So just in response to the question, I think it was about can we comment on how the scenarios affect different partner councils' ability to meet their climate targets, and also on the extent to which they deliver on citizens' assemblies' views. We can certainly add a little bit more about that in future. The Citizens' Assembly commented on the consultation proposals we spoke to a few of the members, and they sort of broadly felt that the consultation proposals were in line with the vision they asked of politicians back in 2019. And so the scenarios will respond to that to varying extents, and it will be again about this balance of what we've heard from the public versus other considerations.
Paul and Christopher. You were actually, weren't you? Yes, my apologies. So can we... Neil, Paul, Christopher. Yeah.
A comment about bus traffic jams. I think it might be worth reiterating the fact that buses can replace 60 or 100 cars. So, you know, we are talking about a reduction in overall traffic, plus allowing us to give travel options to people who might not have any at the moment, not just giving options for people who currently use their car. I agree with, I think it's Claire who said that charge more people less is quite a good way to go. The idea of £3, but have it inflation adjusting, but something that is quite clear at this stage, because it's kind of difficult to think of £5 as something that is going to change anyway or whatever. So be very, very clear with that. On mopeds, and I think we're waiting for the Department for Transport to give us some guidance on what is a moped at the moment. But I think personally that they should be in the mix there somewhere. On something that Heather mentioned about other sources of income, this is clearly not part of this consultation, but I wonder if there is some way, if for instance we come out with a scenario that is less than our ambitions in terms of what we can provide, whether we can say something about further work to find other sources of income, and you know, I'm not sure how much that should be. The other one I wanted to mention was, instead of free days, free minutes, I mentioned before, that might pick up those leaving the city, for instance, or you know, because it's about reducing trips in the city after all. And again, I'm not sure if that's technically feasible, but I wonder if anybody has thought about it or gone into it. Thank you.
So, but there are some questions going in there, but we'll come back after the next two, which is then Paul, then Christopher.
Yeah, I just wanted to make some comments on scenarios 1 and 2, kind of discounting scenario 3, because I suspect there'll be agreement that it's not viable because it doesn't raise enough revenue. Just starting with scenario 2, I worry that scenario, just 3 days, doesn't respond to the consultation feedback, because eventually there will be no 3 days under that scheme. But perhaps we could consider a residual number of 3 days, and I think, you know, 25 or 50, for dealing with those journeys where really, you know, a car is probably the best option. You've got something heavy to carry, or you're giving someone a lift who perhaps can't go on the bus or can't cycle. Those, that would be addressing, I think that would address some of the feedback in the consultation, some of the points made. On scenario 1, I wondered whether an alternative, and I know there was comment made about this as to whether varying by a time of day would be a better, less blunt way of doing things than the peak hour charging. It might deal better with traffic being moved into what they call the shoulder periods. And I think the comment was that it would be more complex to administer and potentially more complex for users to understand. And perhaps built into that would be a higher charge for those that drive more throughout the day. So it would benefit people who may be doing shift work, in that they would only pay for their either incoming or outgoing travel. And I think there is precedent for this. I think the Gothenburg scheme for about 10 years has been doing this. It's a varying charge, and it's also a scheme that charges you according to how much you drive throughout the day. So the Gothenburg.
Thank you, Paul. And then Christopher.
I agree with much what has been said. The more people paying less, that scenarios 1 and 2 as generalisations have more going for them for me than 3. I'm not so keen on that, but I am still very concerned about the point I said in earlier about the credibility of the scheme and people not immediately seeing an advantage from it. It's the one thing that everybody talks to me about when you get into the detail of the discussion, past the initial reaction. Instead of changing the zone or the times, I don't profess to be able to design a scheme here, but could we not actually apply it at certain times of the day, maybe on particular roads and routes? And that's not just everything into the town centre, but maybe the ring road or whatever, so that routes that join the key centres of employment in the city flow and are designed to flow much better for the buses and for cycling and walking, of course. I just think that we're in danger of ending up with a compromise that isn't credible and doesn't work, and people will be understandably very unhappy with that.
Thanks, Christopher. So we'll go back to Lynn. I think there were each of those 3 contributors asked questions. Neil asking about pointers towards further sources, other sources of income, and whether work was possible or had been done on free days in relation to people leaving the city. And Paul was asking about how variable the charge could be. Let's put it that way. And then Christopher, some of the same actually, but also giving us his views about the other scenarios.
In terms of the variability of the charge, there's a trade-off here in terms of how complex you make the scheme and how finely targeted. And one of the things from looking to other schemes elsewhere is that public acceptability tends to be higher when the scheme is straightforward and transparent, and people seem generally less keen on overly complex schemes. In terms of, but it is of course possible, and it's an option that could be looked at. It's not part of the 3 illustrative scenarios we've put forward, but that doesn't mean it's not an option that could be considered. In terms of the varying the different points on the network, the issue only there is that you tend to sort of create rat running when you start doing things like that, and so the network very quickly gets snarled up in a way that wasn't intended. Councillor Shayla asked about whether free days could pick up out commuting. Oh, sorry, 3 minutes. Sorry, I misunderstood that question. Not something I've considered, but we'll take that away and have a look at it. I was going to say in general about the 3 days, though, that sort of the benefit of the 3 days proposal, and this comes to Councillor Bearpark's point a little bit as well. What that 3 days proposal does is recognise that through the consultation, people told us about lots of unusual circumstances in which they would want to use their car, or specific situations. It would be very difficult and administratively expensive to design a regime of exemptions that got to everyone's individual issue. You know, perhaps they've broken their leg and they're not walking for a couple of months, but they don't qualify for a blue badge, or, as I said, taking the pet to the vet. There's all those sorts of things that 3 days kind of can cover the range of them, because the risk of designing very complicated exemption scenarios is that you get it wrong and you leave people out and you don't define it well. So that's a benefit there. In terms of other sources of income, you know, the Combined Authority is currently doing its bus network review and its bus reform work in looking at the sort of bus network in the round and the various sources of revenue available to it, of which this is potentially one.
Thank you, Chair, for letting me come back. Yes, on the minutes one, the idea of 10 minutes and you could accumulate it, again, with this idea of mopping up these unusual ones, you have to go and visit a relative once a week or whatever, but it would also pick up those who just take 3 minutes to get out of town and that's it, and maybe come back a lot later or whatever. It has that same, I think, idea that it gives people a bit more agency. They can decide, do I need to take that trip, and, you know, can I bring it together, and that sort of thing. The other thing I wanted to mention about, again, it goes on with this idea of charge variation. And one of the ones that we heard about was the cost of businesses for their deliveries. And, you know, we are all thinking about ways of keeping HGVs, you know, in the place of things. But if you had a ramping up series of charges over years, it may encourage last mile deliveries, and you know, we'd have fewer vehicles making more trips probably in town, but fewer coming all the way in and out for particular deliveries. And I wonder if that's also been part of the modelling work that you've done.
Further question.
In terms of the freight work in particular, the scenario, well, so all of the scenarios aim to sort of reflect those concerns about deliveries in some ways. Scenarios 1 and 3 by moving to peak hours only charge, which allows more scope for deliveries to be done without charge during the day. And scenario 2 by offering that account holder discount for businesses. You are right that the existence of a charge is more likely to lead the market in terms of logistics and haulage to think about other ways of doing things, whether that be consolidation, whether it be cargo bike last mile, whether it be sort of changing their hours and so forth. You know, elsewhere in the forest in GCP, we are sort of starting to look at a freight consolidation pilot to see what support we would need to give to that in advance of any charge coming in if it did.
Thank you. And now I've got a longer list, so take note of your place in the queue. Someone wants to come in? You happy to join the queue, or okay? It's a long queue, but okay. So Annika, Karen, Claire Ruskin, Claire Daunton, and then okay, and then Mike, and then Simon. Okay, so that's like everyone.
Thank you. My question was leading on from what Lynn was saying about the 3 days and how the fairness of that would be managed. Because how is it going to be administered? If you give it to a household that has 1 car, they get 180 journeys. If you give it to a household that has 2 cars in different directions, they naturally get split. And if you've got a multiple household or a house of multiple adults, again, it gets split even further. And if you give it per car, would it not encourage those that are able to afford it to buy a second car and again get another free allowance? So I'm just interested in how that would be managed moving forward.
Thank you. And then we've got Karen.
Thank you. I'm also picking up on the 3 days, but back to the point about exceptional journeys where there really is no viable alternative. As Paul has already said, those aren't going to go away. You know, people will always potentially need those. So I would also be supportive of some level of 3 days continuing, and I think that would help address a lot of the consultation feedback as well.
Thank you. And then I've got Claire Ruskin.
Then you've referred in the paper to quite a lot of modelling, so some standard models and otherwise. I would love to see the next stage going forward for the details, which we're all able to wallow in for ages, I think. System design, decisions based on the evidence and journeys, and options that will actually give the most help to increase the access and the fairness and the lifetime of our world as well, which we shouldn't forget. Basically trying to encourage the thoughtfulness and sharing of the limited resources that we've got. For those who've got options, a strong nudge to use more sustainable travel, slightly less car journeys, more walking more, try the bus. Those who don't have realistic options, we're obviously focusing on how to help those fairly. The cost of running a car is something like a quarter of state pension per year, per month. It's quite an expensive thing to be running a car, so we are looking at realistic options to relieve that. My preference would be a fully intelligent mechanism. I've always gone for the intelligent charge to adapt over time, so the living thing that the Travel Alliance came up with over the course of thinking about this. But the problem we have is our communications. So clarity and the cost of the administration. So we've got a real issue with communications and changing behaviour because people are so resistant to any thought of any charge that they're not used to. It is a big challenge. There are a lot of small changes I would like to put into this system design mix. For example, for the boundary cases, people living just outside, I would actually go to the point which is called out of charging for each direction because your travel out of town might be out of zone and in might be in the time zone, for example. If you have a maximum of 2 journeys per day, you would come across some of those nuances of people objecting on the grounds of being very close to a boundary. Science Park, I note, has put forward quite a strong claim that it would deter people from coming in. There are nuances there where you could charge people to come from the city into the Science Park, because that could be argued as unnecessary, but you could have the working place levy for the people who are having to come in by car from further away. There's such a big mix of this that I think unless we get the models really quite clearly on the table, as you have started to do, we can't progress very easily with just discussion of 3 days or 4 days. It's got to be the principles of fairness and access, and then the detail of the model that actually shows what we can do. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's what the officers are trying to do by taking us through the bigger decisions and then working on the smaller variations that can make it work or not work. But, yeah, so, I mean, there wasn't actually a question, I think, it was an expression of view. And Karen's was also a view. Annika, I think, was asking about the definition of a free day entitlement. Lynn?
The answer is yes, it could be any of those. There is a decision to be made how you define it, and there will be no right way to define it. There will be ways that work for one group of people and work less well for another. You're right about the perverse incentives of making it per car. There will be some households, though, that feels more difficult for. And so we would just need to work through and recommend, what in our view was the best scenario for decision.
Yeah, so I think the message is that is not, you're hoping, if we're going to have a sort of efficient use of work, that's the sort of thing we would get to after we've decided what sort of scheme we wanted. Yeah. Okay, so now I've got Claire Daunton, Mike Davey, and then Simon.
You'll be pleased to hear that most of my points have been made, and I'm not going to speak unnecessarily. I will just endorse what Neil was saying about the 15, 20 or 5 free minutes, but other people have spoken really eloquently, so I'll stop.
Okay, thank you. So, Mike?
Thank you, Tim. 2 points. I know in our group there was interest in the notion of phasing the geographical area in relation to how the charge may or may not be implemented. If that could be addressed, I think that we'd be grateful, even if it's to say it can't work. But nonetheless, for the very reasons I think was referred to about rat running in the previous question. The second comment, I've been, as you can probably get in touch with my colleague in Oxford about some of the issues that they've faced. One of the things that they did indicate worked for them was about freeing up bus priority zones. And it made a very clear statement about what they were doing during the course of 2 years, which again I think answers Christopher's point, namely that you have to make sure the buses are actually free to run, otherwise you're not going to get any benefit. So whilst it may not be a statement for the actual board papers, nonetheless, if that work could go in parallel, it would be appreciated. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. Simon?
Okay, well, so many people have spoken already. I'm in danger of repeating what people have said, but it's just for the benefit of reinforcement, then it may well be useful. I think the point to be made about this has got to be evidence-based, and it's got to be adaptable. I think a lot of people approaching this from the point of stasis, that I can't change, I won't change, but I can assure people that I was brought up in an environment where there were very few cars, lots of buses, and do you know what? We all survived, we all got by, people got to work, people got to school, people moved around, and it worked. And the fares were cheap. It was a penny halfpenny. I don't know what that is in new money, but they were affordable. They were affordable. So it can work. So I think the thing is that with scenarios, well, everything has to be on the table still. I think that's the other point. A strong case being made, well, what can happen with no STZ? That must stay on the table. So there are problems with one. The issue is that people who have got flexible hours are more likely to be in the professions, but people who are more structured work, are probably lower paid and would be forced to travel during the so it's not as progressive as it could be for those that depend on vehicles. So with 2, I think people have made the point that it starts off with too many free days. I'm very attracted by Christopher's comments that this needs to be seen to be working at a very early stage in the process. But the point of it running out completely of 3 days is similarly unattractive, because the point's been made that there are always going to be those exceptional journeys, and we still have to be thinking about making provision for that key principle that Claire made about fairness. Now, with it, so we're looking at then a blended scenario overall, if this scheme is going to go ahead, and along the way, and Councillor David, Councillor Thornborough have made these points as well, because it's come up from discussion that we've had with our group. We do need to just revisit the relevance or the place of workplace charging, weekend charging, and changes to the boundary on an incremental basis, because that's something that we're going to have a further discussion about.
We've got Katie next, anyway.
Thank you. For when we're looking at options going forward, again, going back to children, I think it's really important that we consider their behaviour while they can't drive. How far can we go to enable them to do as travel and enjoy themselves and learn and work as widely as possible? So I think that would be one, that may be a reason for taking mopeds out of this option, because I know the electric e-scooters, the voice scooters, have actually made a big difference to some young people being able to get them around, but maybe a moped is maybe a next size up. And I also think that going back to what Heather was saying about the trains, what I think Cambridge Station has a 660% increase since 2014 through certain measures that have happened, and it is the biggest mass transit option we've got, and with South Cambridge is coming in maybe Camborne as well. So I think that we should. One of the things I think Mike was talking about, phasing schemes. Is it possible to ensure that the routes, the active travel routes and the bus routes to the train stations are as good as possible, and make sure that we're always thinking about train, bike options, and also making sure we include mobility in that. And then we've also heard about small and medium-sized businesses and the impact on that. And there's a lot of concerns, but I've also heard concerns about businesses who have had trouble recruiting because of the congestion. And it may be, again, it may be with East West Rail coming in, there'll be more mass transit options, but they're not coming for a while. But freeing up the roads can improve the businesses as well as adding concerns. I'm just putting these forward as different things to think about. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Katie. Annika?
Thank you, Chair. I have a question. Adam Brooks is one that seems to go across the scenarios, and I just wondered how much communication there had been about how any scheme would work. For example, if you're going to be using the car parks, have the car parks companies been approached, and do you have a modelling of how that would work, and whether, if you're going to use, for example, going into the car park, whether there's a minimum period of time just to prevent people driving around the car park coming straight out, those kinds of things, and how that would actually work, and how the cost of that being administered would affect the amounts being raised as well.
Okay, I'll take that question to Lynn in a moment, but Heather first.
Thank you, Chair. And I just, after what was said earlier, reinforce that these are my personal views, which I do believe we're all here to express. Just because I'm a different political party to the rest of you does not make my personal views any less irrelevant, I hope, as was suggested earlier. So when I look at I think everybody has received the comments that have come from ABCAM, Age UK, various Cambridge University and NFU and Microsoft. I'm looking for nods, everyone's received those. And there are some quite telling themes throughout a lot of those about how employees are really concerned. And actually in a lot of these industries, they would be in the same categories as sort of 9 to 5, as was suggested earlier. And I think that's a really important point to take on board when looking at timing. The other thing that I think is important to really take on board with this is the impact it will have on recruitment and the economic factors that this will cause. We've got businesses in here, and whether some modelling has been done to see what the shifts. We're making an assumption that Cambridge will be ever expanding, and that's quite right, based on the current situation. But has there been any modelling done to establish what the impact this will have? Because there will be negative as well as positive impacts that go hand in hand. The other thing, which I have a question on, which was triggered by something said earlier on in parking. Now, in one of the various, and forgive me because there have been various documents on this subject, one of which was that there was going to be potentially a need for an agreement with parking companies to sort of help all the council, because obviously their income would be decreased. I'm just wondering how much compensation will the STZ be paying towards councils and car park companies to compensate their loss of revenue, whether that's still the case, and if so, how much? Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Just to set the record straight, what I said earlier was, I am not going to ask officers to engage with you on a political debate. They're not here for that. They're here to help us.
Yeah, again, that's not what I asked.
They are here to help us with an understanding of the papers and other points that people make from a practical and strategic nature. They're not here to comment on your political views, just the same as they aren't here to comment on my political views or anyone else's.
Chair, and other members of the Assembly have identified genuine questions from which you did
so
not
where
allow
you
to be
have
asked.
identified a genuine question, it will be answered. So let's leave it like that, and you have just asked some, and they will be answered. But I don't want you to go away with the idea that you've been pigeonholed as having political views and therefore no one's going to listen, because we have listened. And we will engage with them if people want to. Members of the Assembly, if they want to, they can engage with you on those political views. And so far, that hasn't happened very much.
My point was they are personal views. It's not everything is just politically driven.
I will not ask, and this is the same in all local councils, this isn't specific to the GCP. We will not invite officers to engage in a political debate. Well, you were asking for that earlier on. But let's move on, and I've got a question from Annika.
The documentation you're referring to, Heather, I don't think I've seen that unless it was in, is that been set separately to people? The feedback you got from businesses, was that part of our papers, or is this?
No, that's why I did ask. I think it's been sent to all Assembly members and some board members. It's a document which I can send for you to see.
Could you send it to officers so we can make sure everybody gets it?
Yeah, I did check with one. We thought most, obviously, I think we were on the list.
I might have just missed it. But
okay, I'll have a look and see if you're on it.
I'll just comment, some of us were sent something by CRG, the Neil Mackay group, I think, and it had very short sound bites from the letters that were in the full data pack. So if you read the full letters, then you could take out some little snippets that they had highlighted, which was fair enough.
Okay. So just for transparency, as something's being referred to in the meeting, we'll try and get hold of it and make sure everybody's got it, because there's quite a lot of shaking heads when it was asked whether everyone's seen it, so we'll get hold of it and circulate it to all Assembly and board members after the meeting. Yep, and Lynn's just reminded me all stakeholder responses are online, so if they are taking extracts, the full responses were always published and available online anyway.
Okay, so there was a question from Annika, which related to arrangements at Addenbrooke's.
She's just taken a conflict break, so if we could do
Okay, so let's do her second and Heather's questions, which were modelling on the impact, negative and positive, on employees working for local employers, and a question on compensation to councils for loss of parking revenue. Lynn.
Okay, Chair. In terms of the business impact work, we have done an amount of thinking about business impacts. The purpose of the consultation was to gather more evidence. You've just highlighted some that's been provided through the stakeholder responses. The next stage will have us looking in more detail at that and better delving down and understanding those impacts to support any future recommendation we make if the board asks us to carry on. But you're right, in terms of business impacts, some businesses expressed concern around recruitment impacts and issues like that. Others have expressed concern that without something to support their staff to get to work, they will have recruitment impacts. So as with all of these elements, it will be a question of balancing competing feedback. There sort of aren't obvious or easy answers as a response to the consultation feedback. There is a question of how you take everything you've learned and apply it to what you choose to do next. In terms of car park revenue and other financial issues, one of the pieces of work that would follow later this year is an integrated parking strategy, which would look at parking in the round, including sort of modelling financial impacts. There are a number of things that will drive car parking revenue into the future, including but not limited to whether or not there's an STZ, and there are issues that will drive it in both directions. And so there's a further piece of work to be done on the detail of that and whether anything's required. In terms of Councillor Osborne's question on the Addenbrooke's exemption, I feel like actually this is 3 questions where my answer is all work at the next stage. If the board asks us to carry on with looking at these options in more detail, we will go and sort of talk to the car park providers and understand what's the best way. As with almost everything we've said here, there's a variant of it that is probably sort of lower bureaucracy but more poorly targeted, and a version that is more expensive to administer but sort of better targeted in both those cases. So it'll be a case of us working through that, talking to the hospitals who are in the car parks and so forth, and working out what would work for them and coming back with a recommendation.
You. Some views have been expressed about blending already, so I assume that people have taken that in the ambit of what we're currently talking about, and I'd just like to give my view that I think in terms of option 2, like others, I'm of the view that there would need to be a residual continuing number of free days for that to be an option that would make sense to me. In terms of option 1, I can see that option 1 does address the concern that many people have, that it's focused on periods when congestion occurs now. But I also have the concern about that approach that that now can change as a result of that kind of option, and so you end up by having the congestion in the middle of the day. I wonder whether there is an option that corresponds better to this, which involves having a lower charge between the peaks, and using that as the way of managing the congestion that could arise in the middle of the day, possibly added to that some residual free days as well. But those are some personal views that I've let others make theirs, so I've given mine. What I would like to do is to try and see where we are in the bigger picture, because there are lots of questions people have raised. Katie, I'll come back to you afterwards. You want a break? Okay, yeah, I'm fine with that. If we might, yeah. Okay, so let's get back here at 4:20, 10 minutes. Yeah.
So all the hospitals, not just Addenbrooke's, but the various hospitals on the hospital site, one of the options includes suggestion that people who work there, visited there, or patients would have free access. They'd go through the ANPR cameras, and as long as they were stayed long enough, they wouldn't have to charge. How would you compare that with the option in the next scenario, or some other scenarios, about having a number of free days for drivers, which could have a similar effect, particularly when we're encouraging the various hospital sites to be more car-free with better bus links and cycle links and general infrastructure. Thank you.
Lynn, would you like to take that?
Just to agree with you, Councillor, that they are sort of substitutes for one another, really. So there's one where you sort of focus very much on the site and say people visiting the site shouldn't pay. And there's another way you recognise that everyone will have their various different reasons for needing an exemption on a given time, and the 3 days reflects that. For most people that visit the hospital in most scenarios, whether it's, you know, the odd appointment, or whether it's that, you know, your mum's in hospital for a couple of weeks and you go every day for a fortnight, a budget of 3 days per year ought to cover you for that, probably. And the things that we already had in the consultation proposal about making sure that people with long-term chronic conditions who couldn't use public transport had an exemption anyway would probably cover the residual.
Is that okay, Graham? Okay, to try and draw this to a close, in a sense, this is a little bit less required because the board is here and they've heard. So, my feeling was that there was a view from some that all options should remain on the table. That was, I think, 5? No, probably they meant 4 on the table. So, including the original proposal. Okay, well, all 5, it doesn't, at that level, it doesn't matter really. But the actual sort of energy in the room around the conversation focused on 1 and 2 and ideas by which they could be amended or blended. We've heard the context from the officers, which are that we've got a known list of all sorts of other issues which they really need to know which option they would be associated with before it's efficient for them to work on further. Would there be a willingness for members of the Assembly to see a focus on that question of options 1 and 2 and how they could be changed and blended to reflect the conversation we've just had as a next stage, without taking the other options off the table, because you can't, it's really difficult, I think, as you take this further and further forward, to look at everything all at the same time. Is that something, now, what I don't want is people saying only if and only if and only if, because we've got all that, we've heard all of those contributions, but is that a sensible feedback from what we have discussed? Katie?
I would suggest that the focus would be on those 2 options and blended options, but as you say, if the board felt that there was merit in what was in option 3, then or elements of it, then I wouldn't want to restrict the board in what they in their discussions.
Okay, so focus being the key word in that rather than exclusive. Yeah. Okay. Others, Neil?
Sorry, yes. So 1 and 2 would blends, but you know those other things. So it's not just blended, but you know other. And we'll keep it as wide as possible. We don't want to make it easy on the board.
So easy for us. I feel so easy.
All the officers, yeah. So, is there any contrary opinion to that? We've got Claire.
Just slightly more focused, perhaps. I've felt less support for the no charge during the off-peak hours then I have felt fairly strong support for a small number of free days, but not the large number that is in the proposal at the moment.
Noted. Thank you. Heather?
Obviously, we've not all agreed on scenarios, but I think what we have all agreed on is that there needs to be some information for the board on Thursday about costings and what the net gain is, whether that's admin costs or compensation costs. So on each scenario, what it is that's the actual benefit and the gross, or sorry, net income that it would bring.
This is the coat hanger theory of debate, isn't it? Can I see if someone else, Claire's the only one with a hand, so Katie, go ahead.
I do think the comment that has come forward is about the 7-day charging with 2 days flexible, or a number of days flexible over 7 days rather than just Monday to Friday, is something that would be worth considering.
So, as I understand it, and officers perhaps correct me if I'm wrong, the issue there is that we would have to do a whole new consultation to include days that were never in the first consultation. So would that be something that you still wanted to pursue?
I think with the gunning principles about being, I think it's really important that if we have, it has come forward as part of a response, and I think it's something we should be shown to at least consider. I hope it wouldn't. Obviously, I don't think any of us are keen to go forward for another consultation at this stage.
Rachel, would you want to clarify?
Yeah, I think the issue is that it's about being transparent about what we're consulting on, and the proposal for a Saturday and a Sunday charging was not in the consultation. And whilst you're absolutely right, some small level of respondents did suggest that should be added in. I think we need to take it away and get further advice as to whether that would be sufficient on which to introduce something that we did not ask the question about. My personal view is I think that would probably be stretching it, but let us take that away and get some advice about it. I think we might just want to come back to Councillor Williams' point on administrative costs as well, because just to be clear about that, in the earlier stages of the work, in terms of the strategic outline business case, we have included those at a high level for what we knew at that point. I just wanted to stress that as you are developing this work, there's only a certain amount of detail you can nail until you know fully what you're going forward with. So just to manage members' expectations around how much detail, but there is already some available and in the public domain about indicative costs for implementing a road user charge. That already exists. We can point people to where that is published, but we wouldn't then nail that for until the next stage when we're clearer about the different combinations that we'd be looking at. If that's helpful.
So the point, Katie's point,
we'll answer.
You'll give more informed, reinforced advice about that. The cost of operation, I mean, yeah, I do recall this is published for the original proposals, because I've had people writing to me quoting the original consultation support papers. Just wanted to, note a couple of the additional. Is it about the same point, Heather? Go ahead.
The issue is the different scenarios, not just what was consulted on, do trigger different. For example, if there was some form of means testing for lower income, these all have costs attached. So I appreciate that there was an admin fee published for road charging, but all of these things that have been said create more administrative costs to run it, or potentially the means testing. So it's on each scenario. Doesn't have to be to the penny, but would you see it admin increase or decrease based on each scenario? Would this be a start?
So Heather, if you remember on page 39 of the report, which we covered earlier, there are a series of things which we agreed to accept that the officers would get to when we had a working assumption about what a scenario would look like. And And so those costs, those specific things, would not be arrived at until that had been done. Lynn?
Just to add, Councillor Williams, that as Rachel just said, essentially there's a restriction to the amount of detail we can go into until we know broadly what we're doing. But what we have tried to put throughout this paper is clarity where we know option A would be substantially more expensive than option B in terms of admin costs. So we've tried to give you that high-level steer for the purposes of scenarios, but to go sort of into the specific admin cost would require quite a lot of detailed design of exactly how the thing was designed, which risks being abortive work if you do it for a huge range of things. So we've tried to keep it at that level of this will be substantially more expensive than that in terms of admin costs.
Helen?
If I understand it right, where we've sort of got this scoring scheme, deliverability kind of tries to capture that in some way, doesn't it? Whether it's complex, easy, or harder to deliver. So it's not costed, but it's gives a kind of proxy for what the in effect the admin cost would be. Is that correct?
So I've missed out a couple of people here. So I've got Claire Ruskin and Annika.
I was going to say I don't feel a need for detailed costing at the moment, and I don't think the board would at this high level. And secondly, I was going to say I don't think we should reopen the weekends instead, or the choice of 2 days out of the week that it does or doesn't charge, partly because of the consultation, but also I suspect it is regressive. I suspect more key workers have to work on Saturdays and Sundays and therefore get more benefit if we stick with Monday to Friday as the charging days.
Thank you. Annika?
Thank you. I'm just wondering, moving forward, you're obviously going to be proposing new scenarios potentially with a bit of blending. How will we get a similar thing for us to have a look at, where we get new scenarios where you've again put in different things, or how's that going to work for us to, or for the board to assess moving forward? And then I just wondered if there is any way of kind of having a look at the more carrot things as well, like bike trials, e-bike trials, free cycle training and things like that, to incentivise a shift in that respect as well as part of the package.
Just jumping ahead. I was
Sorry.
going to be summarising that point in just a moment, but Rachel, would you like to answer the other point that Annika, the first point that she asked?
Just remind me what it was, Annika, sorry.
Now my brain's gone blank.
Oh,
so.
sorry. What next in terms of options? So as the recommendation says, you know, we would be subject to the board discussion on Thursday. Their recommendation in front of them is that they ask officers to do further work based on your feedback today and whatever the board says on Thursday, that would then iterate to develop a scenario in which we would then be able to do that more detailed work, because more detail would be required for an outline business case, which effectively is the next stage.
When you put together, I'm just wondering, because there's been a lot of conflicting views, how this next scenario then gets assessed. So obviously there'll be some things that some people will support and some people won't. So how is that potential final scenario assessed?
Going to that? Lynn?
Yes, well, if the board asks us to proceed with some work, we will take the technical work we've done so far. We've got more technical work to do. We've had steers from the Joint Assembly. We expect to get further steers from the board. We will put those together and work towards a recommended preferred option, potentially with some backup options and variability around that the board can then consider.
Okay. What I was just going on to say was that there are a number of other points which have been raised during the meeting on this part of the meeting, which kind of were not discussed before and don't particularly appear in the papers, which I think we need to highlight as something that could be parked and looked at. One which may have an impact on blending and so forth was there were some interesting contributions about variability and how that could be delivered, whether that was possible and to what degree, and whether that had a role in terms of the way an STZ works. There was then some contributions about the importance of supporting behaviour change, which seemed to me important, and part of what people also talked about, the need to do some confidence building in the run-up to using any kind of road charging. And then on the low-income issue, you said that, that it seemed most logical to do something based on existing benefits, but to also consider whether there's some benefits on the positive side of the equation that could also be envisaged as well. So, and the board anyway heard all the rest as well, so if your point wasn't summarised, then you feel confident they heard you. So the next section was section 11, which was about the phased introduction of bus services. That's page 49 and 50. And that, the specific things that I felt we should be drawn towards here is whether we're okay with the principles around which the future bus network would be designed, which are in 11.4 in the bullet points. And I mean, I think they have lain behind a lot of what we've actually seen in the consultation material and so forth, but I think officers are bringing that forward to us to sort of, to remind us that when we're thinking about different levels of public transport and sustainable travel provision maybe being possible, then you need to have quite a good, clear idea of what your principles are so that you know where you're going in making changes. So are there any views on those bullet points in 11.4? Claire, Annika, Katie.
Yes, I've got lots of views on this, but I'll be brief. I think it's very important that there is connectivity between bus, rail and cycle throughout the Greater Cambridge area, and not just in the city, but outside the city. I think park and ride, it's really important to get the services to the park and ride to make them as good as possible, not just the length of the day from 5:30 in the morning until late at night, but actually to make it a pleasanter experience. I think there'll have to be a lot of work done looking at where the congestion coming into the city falls and why that's happening and where the gaps are in the bus services coming into the city. I know the officers know where those are, I know where they are, and I hope that there will be a lot of work done to deal with that in relation to rural bus services. On the issue of Cambridge North, the connections to Cambridge North and the whole issue of Cambridge North being in and out of the zone, I think that needs to be looked at again. Connecting small rural communities both to cycle routes and to bus routes is really important, and it might not be the conventional bus service, it might be a new look bus services, but making sure that as much connectivity as possible reaches those rural communities. And as said, I think it was said earlier that I think probably coming out of the consultation, reliability and frequency was actually less important than fares, though obviously fares will need to be taken into account. And going back to one of the points that we've all emphasised and I feel very strongly about, and that's fairness across the board, when looking at the bus services, the bus routes, think about the fairness issue there, where people are coming from on low incomes, where they're going to, on the bus, the connectivity there that's lacking at the moment, and putting in the bus services that deal with that fairness issue. And just one anecdote as well, which people in the city will recognise. One of the major roads in the city, Coldham's Lane, there's no bus service on Coldham's Lane. It's extraordinary. I mean, you know, I've got used to no bus services where I live. I regret it bitterly, and no cycle paths. Peter has heard me say that many times over. But to not have a bus service down Coldham's Lane, that's quite extraordinary. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on bus routes.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Claire. Not a specific question, I think, but a powerful list of important factors. Yes, thank you for that. I then got Annika and then Katie.
Thank you. Mine is going to be a reiteration of what Claire said. It's important that it's not just in and out of the city that we're focusing on. It is between villages that don't have a route at the moment, but people want to have buses that go to work. So all of what Claire has said, I absolutely agree with. And with the fares, it's important that the fare cost, especially for families and people travelling in groups, is weighed against the cost of the STZ. Because without that, people will still take their cars, they will still go with the congestion. And that's, again, for trip chaining as well.
Thank you. Katie.
Yeah, I think as well as the park and rides being travel hubs, I think train stations need to be travel hubs. And ideally, again, the bus scheduling should be extended not just to the park and rides, but also to Addenbrooke's. And ideally, the bus timetable would align with the nurses' work schedule. They would also align with the train timetables, and I think yes, yeah. And also, whenever we think about the buses, we must think about being able to walk and cycle to the main bus where bus stops are. So more bike parking and really secure bike parking. People have to know that when they get off the bus and cycle home, their bike's going to still be there.
Thank you, Katie. I'm just assuming that this is all, they're not really questions, but they are important because I think it's almost like a brainstorming session that we've moved into here. So I hope someone's taking a note of everything, right? Because they aren't going to get a summary from me because they're not really in contention and it's a good, rich list. So we've then got Graham, Neil and Heather.
Thanks, Tim. So two more things for the list from me. Whilst I agree with everything that's been said and everything that's written in this section, I'd like to see more money spent on bus lanes and infrastructure improvements, and then making sure that the park and ride sites are sufficiently out of the centre so that cars coming into park and ride don't have to queue before they get to the park and ride sites, and then that the buses can whiz through to the city centre or go round the orbital routes to wherever people need to work. Thank you.
I think some of that is embedded in our other parts of the programme, but
I think it is, but I would just like to ensure that the infrastructure in particular is listed.
That's great. Neil?
Thank you, Chair. Just a very brief point that it mentions bus reform here as the CPCA element, but I think it needs to be reiterated that none of this can happen without bus reform. We cannot decide where the buses go at the moment. And in terms of the financial implications, I mean, my preference is, of course, for as much franchising as we can get. But I think this should be mentioned that we cannot do anything without bus reform.
So I'm told that bus reform can't do very much without this. So we're in a symbiotic relationship. Thank you. Heather.
So my ward, most of the parishes in my ward have no buses at all. We do have a train station, of which not a single bus goes to it. And I would say that a big emphasis, you're not going to get people on a bus all the way to Cambridge from where I am. It would take 3 hours if I was to get a bus from my village because you don't go directly to and from. I don't think there's been enough emphasis so far at getting bus to train station. We do have in the south a lot of train stations that are probably underutilised as a consequence. So I think looking at it as a whole transport system would be much better because buses alone are not the answer to achieving the objectives here. You simply will not get people on buses to do the journeys that they need to do.
Thank you. That's it. Okay. So I'm going to say thank you for those contributions on that list in 11.4. And then there is another list in 11.5, which is the suggested preliminary thinking about the improvements that one would regard as priorities using the pump priming money that the GCP would anticipate delivering this 50 million pounds, where that would go starting from 2024. And as it says, the bulleted list is derived from the gaps in the existing network, which has been mentioned, and the consultation feedback. Are there any comments on that? Only everyone. Okay, go on, Heather, then.
Thank you. So I'm going to recall, and I'm going to get told if I'm wrong, something that Andy said once about a bus. Look, he's definitely awake now. In that they laid on a bus and nobody went on it, and it was completely free of charge. So this, to my Brian, is that at me? I've sort of got a finger pointed in my direction. Is that? Oh, that's something else. It's just okay. Oh right, okay. Shall I carry on? I'm not being sort of pointed down.
Ignore the interruption.
Thank you. So I don't think that subsidising bus fares is the right incentive to start with. That's sort of top on the list. I think you need to, people, even if it's free, it's been proven that people aren't going to go to A to B if it's not an easy way. So subsidising bus fares might help to, once you've got things in place, get people on there, intrigue, but it should not be the first thing.
Thank you. Kristen Ann.
Thank you. I think it's a good order for us to start debating what we can introduce while we've still got congestion in certain routes. I think I would want to see the outcome of whether the subsidising bus fares that has gone on has had any impact, building on Heather's point just now. I then think making sure that we've filled in the gaps in the routes that have sort of been cut or most valued would be, that we haven't got, is a really important thing. And my final point is that though I worry in this list that we've started to gain focus on just the bus improvement part of this scheme. And so, and I appreciate this is the first time we're seeing it, but I think if we lose the sense that it's not just buses, it's behavioural change, it's walking and cycling that needs to be in here, we're going to have potentially, if we change the scheme, challenges on the revenue side, and I don't want it all just to be, well, we're then just going to see how we phase on the buses. We need to be looking at a list of what we introduce in a holistic sense.
Yes, I think that would reflect the earlier conversation, wouldn't it, really? Although the section is headed phased in bus services, we're talking about a ramp up, aren't we? And the sustainable travel angle and the behaviour change needs to be, I think, present somewhere there. Okay, Karen.
Very similar point to which Kristen Ann has just made. We've spoken earlier about potentially ring fencing some of this pot for other types of modal shift as well. So I think that's really important, and maybe we should consider a certain amount of that. It seems to have been quite neglected in this paper, the other types that we've discussed earlier, and if we need earlier investment in those as well.
Okay, thank you. Reinforced point. Great. And now I've got Neil, Paul and Christopher.
Thank you very much. And I think on the same list, to start with, the fare subsidies are also about change, getting people to try the thing, with as least pain as possible. But on that list, I think there should be reliability. That is, we've seen this in the results, and that's about knowing that the service is going when you want. If you have to wait for a variable amount of time, it's a terrible message. It's telling you that your time doesn't matter. So this comes back again and again, has to be reliable.
Thank you. Paul?
Yeah, just a couple of points. Just to reinforce really what's been said before about trying, during this transition of introducing buses, also introducing measures to encourage active travel. So I think some sort of funded proposal to support that, because obviously during that time we want to get congestion down, and that could possibly help with that. The second point is related to the way, I think buses are held up in two ways really. One is that there's congestion, but also there's people getting on and off the bus. So I wondered if, it's 20 years since the introduction of the Oyster card. I wondered if we could be bringing that in sooner, some sort of tap-on, tap-off service as part of this introduction.
That's a good new point, I think, really. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that is one of the key things that seems to hold up journeys, isn't it? Okay, so we've then got Christopher.
Perfectly leads into the point I wanted to make, actually. The other reason that bus journeys take a long time is they stop a lot of times and go on a bit of a roundabout tour of the countryside, as point Heather just made. In terms of priority order, trying to get buses to cover all of the routes in from outside is not necessarily, in my mind, right at the top of the list. We need, for this scheme to work in the core area that we're concerned about, we need tens of thousands of people to make a different choice. And I think it's a lot about the interchange points that we've been discussing earlier, and the priority to get those right up and working really well so that people feel inclined. They may want to use their cars from the villages because that is the easiest and quickest way in. If they can then get to an interchange point and seamlessly get into a bus, cycle, scooter, whatever, walk, run, where they want to go to, then they'll be inclined to do so. So I'm not entirely convinced that top priority trying to get buses going everywhere just becomes very, very expensive, and it's still very, very slow.
Thanks, Christopher. Katie?
Yeah, just following on what Heather was saying, I think the bus routes need to be focusing on the train stations, and having integrated bus train tickets would be great. Also going forward, I think just as when we build a new building, we have a building in use review after we've occupied it. I think there should be transport in use when, to see we're planning something and let's review it and let's have people have a say about it. Not a new consultation, but some feedback about what works and what doesn't work. And I also would like to know about how, again, in 3 or 4 years, whether we actually achieved some accident reduction in the urban areas as well.
Good points, thank you. I just wanted to say something about fare subsidies because I think when you see that on a list on its own, you can come to a different conclusion about it than seeing it in the context of a relationship between a road charge and the fare having been subsidised. Because what I think needs to be constructed here is a situation where a fare is the cheaper option than a road charge. And so I think that the subsidy had kind of the joint function, both in relation to the road charge and to help people incomes who already use those services. But it's on the list anyway, so I don't need to really make the point. Simon?
I just wanted to add to that point, Chair, that there was a suggestion earlier on that there would be, during the charging hours, 12-hour charging hours, that there would be a reduction during the non-peak period. Well, if that was the case, then the differential between using a bus and going by car, there'd hardly be any difference in it. So there'll be no financial incentive to change from car to bus or active transport. So if we do that, the corollary of that is there's a deeper discount for travelling by bus during those times. And we can't have it when there's such a narrow differential to it just won't work.
I mean, I'm assuming that those points have all been recorded. Again, they mainly weren't in conflict with each other. So let's leave that point that section of the report there. And then there's just one other angle that we need to cover, and that is on pages, if you go back in the report, pages 7 and 8. Page 7, top of page 8. And these are the recommendations that the board is going to be facing at their meeting on Thursday. And in fact, A, B, and now A and B are now covered by discussions that we've had. So we can tick off our progress through this. But points C, D, and E are also recommendations, and they're more of a process nature than the other two. Is there something, would you like just to explain those in case we might want to have a view?
I think in terms of little c was what we covered in relation to Councillor Osborne's question earlier, so that really is whether the board wants to ask us to work with Cambridge County Council officers to work up an iteration of this scheme that would then go forward for decision in the autumn. The D and E are really about, you know, the partnership nature of our environment, where we would want to work with the combined authority on any of the bus improvements in particular going forward. So both in terms of what that looks like for any long-term improvements, but also in terms of that spending of the 50 million. It would be a decision for GCP, but as has already been touched on in the discussion, you'd want to spend that in a way that is aligned with the longer-term plan, so that you're not doing something only for the short term that would have a cliff edge. So we, again, need to work with the Transport Authority, which is the combined authority, to ensure that alignment. And so we're just asking the board to agree those two pieces of work. As you say, they're mainly about the process, but it is about moving it forward to the next stage.
Question is, are there any views about this? They seem to me necessary and important, in particular, to work with our partners. But who's had a recent go? Katie hasn't.
So, for when working with the Cambridgeshire County Council, I wonder if you could explain the decisions or the level of decision making that the GCP board will get to, and how open it could still be before it goes to the county council, or because of the amount of the 50 million that's involved, would the GCP board be the entity that makes a decision about the expenditure of that based on this scenario going forward, and then that all goes to the county council and they just say yes or no? Or would the county council then be in a position where they could consider it and adapt it? Or if you could help, if you could explain that, it'd be helpful. Thanks.
Do you want to do that now? Yeah, before we go to Simon.
So the 50 million that the board has currently set aside to forward fund improvements is a decision for the GCP board. The intention, as we see it currently, is that if the county council, as the Highways Authority, does need to agree a road user charge, if the county council took a decision to do that, then we would come back and confirm that spend to be released from the GCP's budget. So that's a decision that is entirely for the GCP on spending that amount of money. Clearly, they wouldn't want to do that unless they knew that there was a road user charge that was going to sustain the funding over the longer term.
Thank you. Thank you. Simon?
So this is about D in this section. C and E have got specific timelines, specific dates. We've just rehearsed the symbiotic relationship between bus reform and the sustainable travel zone. And I think it's important that a timeline is added in there so that we're all working in synchronisation in a timely manner. Because that one thing can't work with the other. So you get my point. If there could be amendment to that.
Okay, so the question is, could there be a timeline on that one? Yeah. Do you want to answer that, Rachel?
You want to answer? There is a timeline that the CPCA has.
The CPCA are working to a programme timeline. They are still hoping to publicly announce that in their July board, but they're working on that. I will speak to CPCA officers to see if this can be amended to add a timeline.
Very good. And I gather Brian wanted to speak.
Yeah, just a quick question about the CPCA versus the mayor. I'm sorry if I'm fixated on this pedantic point, but as the mayor has ultimate say over franchising, do we need to reference him in this section, or is that effectively covered by mention of the CPCA?
I answer that, Chair.
Sorry, yes. I was just telling my co-chair that he was coming back to her soon. But, yeah.
I mean, I think this is, the wording of this recommendation is more about us working, you know, with the CPCA's officer level. Ultimately, there's decision-making at the CPCA. Franchising, you know, is a mayoral decision, but I, you know, wouldn't want to speak for him, but I assume he'd want to do that, you know, with his board alongside as well. But this recommendation is really about how we take the work forward at a technical level, so that's about us working with officers.
Thank you. I think we've reached the end. So, not without a further point from Katie.
I thought on your list there was something about communications right at the bottom, and I just think that the transparency and being as clear as possible going forward, you know, making sure that the documents are readily available and the programme is as clear as possible. I think you're doing all the right things, but we just need to make sure that we try and make sure the public knows what's happening and setting it out very simply so that they know what to expect when. Thank you.
The impression Rachel was probably nodding, but did you want to say that?
We do our best. You know, as you have just demonstrated through this conversation, it is a very complex issue. It's a lot easier to say what you don't like rather than form a scheme that delivers to all the benefits that you are, you know, the board has set us as objectives to try to achieve. So that's my sort of slightly defensive nature around the communications, but absolutely we are trying to explain why we're doing this, but it has a whole range of different reasons.
I'll seize that moment to say that I think we've finished our Assembly discussion. I hope we've taken the story forward a little bit. We had asked for this session to look at what this bundling different changes up into different packages might look like. I think we've debated that thoroughly, and I think we've given some feedback that the board can consider when they meet on Thursday. So back to Elisa.
Thank you very much, Tim. Excellent co-chairing, or I should say, you know, excellent chairing. I did the easy bits. I would like to thank everybody for very, very good points. I have listened very intently to all of them. The board will reflect what we've heard today in our discussion on Thursday. Absolutely, they will. There are a couple of points that I would like to make in response to something I've heard quite early on. I mean, I think it's important. I mean, I'm not particularly bothered, how many scenarios we keep on or off the table. If it's 4, 5, 6, 7, I mean, it doesn't really matter that much. What matters is what we want to achieve. And I think I've made this very clear every time I've been on the media, etc. I'm not ideological about having to have a charge or anything at all. What I am ideological about is reality and realistic ability to realistically achieve what we say we want to do. So if we want to consider a scenario where we have improved park and rides, services, free shuttles to hospital, and bus franchising, that does require an income. These things require money to spend. So we absolutely do need to have a real clarity about how we're going to achieve whatever we agree that we will achieve. Because God knows we are desperate for those things. And we absolutely should not discount people that are desperate for those things. And as Neil has said, we absolutely also have to continue to be quite clear that at the moment, it doesn't matter how many decisions we take. We can't tell Stagecoach what to do. They will do what they like. They will absolutely do what they like. They will do what serves their commercial interests. That's the point of running something commercially. If we want that to change, we've got to do something about it. So that'll need to be the decision, really. Do we want that to change? So, and we can't do this alone, of course, which is where little c and little d and little e came about. We have got to work with our partners, otherwise we can deliver nothing. It's very easy to spend 50 million, it will disappear down the drain, and you won't notice. So if we're going to have to make it matter, we need to do that quite cleverly. So all of that will be discussed at length on Thursday and beyond. My inbox is open, as it always has been, to people wanting to tell me what they think. My inbox is unfortunately open. I have had a lot of things there that I don't like. But that should not be a reason for people to actually tell me constructive things that I need to hear. So I will remain very, very happy to have that, especially in terms of things that we want to consider. Please, Heather, talk to me about those things that you want us to do. I want to hear them. I have heard them. I want to hear them again. So it's very, very important that everybody brings their constituency to this debate. So we should all do that. So we'll see some of you back on Thursday, and there will be further discussion after that, no doubt. But for the moment, thank you very much, Tim, for carrying the meeting as you did, and everyone for coming.